Thank you. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, back to another hearing session. My name is Yvonne Wright. I'm one of the inspectors who's been appointed to examine the local plan, the legal compliance and soundness of that plan. My colleague, Mr. Warden, is also present, and we will be both involved in asking questions and having discussions. So, Mr. Warden, would you like to say good morning?
Good morning, everybody.
Now, there are a few new participants both involved in that have not taken part in sessions today. I will be doing some introductions. I'm not going to be doing any major housekeeping matters, etc. I think Ms. Feeney has gone through the phone, turning off phones, etc., and hands functions, and camera on, camera off, etc., etc. So I'm not going to go through any of that any further. And what I do want to do, I know that participants received an email from Ms. Feeney last evening. What I do want to do is just do quick introductions for this session. So we're here, this is matter 12A, looking at transport and connectivity. And then we will, we did send out an agenda. That agenda was written before the Highways England comments were accepted, which came in very recently. So if you can bear with us while I'll do the introductions, then I'll get the council to let us know what we can and can't discuss today in relation to the implications of the Highways England letter. We do consider we can potentially discuss some matters. I don't think there is necessarily a reason why we can't discuss some things, but I will let the council explain from their perspective what we can and can't discuss today. And that isn't just in relation to matter 12A, that's in relation to other matters this week as well. So it'd be quite very useful for the council to make that clear. Can I just ask everybody to introduce themselves, just so that I can make sure that everybody who is supposed to be here today is here, starting with the council, please.
Good morning, Ma'am. I'm Paul Shedderevian, QC, acting for the council.
Thank you.
Good morning, Inspectors. Phil Drain, Director of Planning and Economy at Brentwood Council. Thank you.
Good morning, Inspectors. Jonathan Quilter, Strategic Planning Manager at Brentwood Council.
Thank you.
Good morning, Inspectors. Tom Huang, Planning Policy Planner, Brentwood Borough Council.
Thank you.
Inspectors, if I just introduce some of the technical support that we have also on the line in case we need to. We have Margaret Theobald and Paul Gebbett from Stantec, who have been assisting us on the transport assessment. David Ubaka, who's been assisting on pulling together lots of the transport evidence and some other matters regarding Dunton Hills Garden Village and how that fits together with development. And Simon Drummond Hay, who I think is online, may not be, but is here in case needed for viability matters.
Thank you. Cycle Brentwood, please.
Good morning, I'm Jeff Fletcher. I'm the Director at Tronet CIC. I'm Chair of Cycle Brentwood, and I'm here to represent Cycle Brentwood today.
Thank you. And S&J Padfield and St Modwin, please.
Good morning, Ma'am. My name is Reuben Taylor, QC, and I'm here representing that party. With me, I've got Mr. Hollingworth and Mr. Catesmark providing support.
Thank you. Essex County Council, please.
Good morning, Inspectors. I'm Mark Robinson. Good morning, Mark Robinson, Principal Transport and Infrastructure Planner at Essex County Council, representing Essex's Highway Authority. I'm joined by Alan Lindsay and James Whiffin from Wingway Jacobs for technical matters.
Thank you. Mr. Minot, please.
Yes, sorry.
Good morning, Inspector. Yes, I'm Philip Minor. I'm one of the local councillors, but as usual, we say I'm not speaking as a councillor today. I'm speaking as an individual.
Thank you, Mr. Minor. And Tesco, please.
Morning, ma'am. Rupert Warren, QC for Tesco Stores, instructed by GL Hearn. I've got Mr. Atkinson from GL Hearn with me today, who you've seen before, and Mr. McDonald on highways. Later in the day, if we get there, Dr. Zheng, also on air quality. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. West Horndon Parish Council, please.
Good morning. My name's Councillor Colin Fone. I'm Vice Chair of West Horndon Parish Council, and I lead on planning for the council.
Thank you, Mr. Fone. CEG, please.
Yes. Good morning. Mike Axon. I'm a transport planner with Vectos, acting for DHGV.
Thank you. Priest Lane Residents Association, please.
I'm Kate Webster, representing Priest Lane Neighbourhood Residents Association.
We have people entering and exiting. I don't know if you can hear those, but quite distracting. Sorry, Miss Webster.
Apologies, that's Highways England had some technical difficulties and they were coming in and out on a phone. Apologies.
That's fine. Thank you. Right, thank you, Miss Webster, for the introduction. Is Highways England in the meeting now then?
Yes, ma'am, we are.
Brilliant. Okay. Do you want to introduce yourself then, please?
Yes, Janice Burgess, Highways England, a special planner, and I also have with me today Nigel Walton, who is my technical consultant.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. Right, nobody else. Okay, right. Thank you. Can I then come directly to the council, please? Because it would be very useful to understand the council's take on Highways England's letter and how that will impact on discussions today in relation to matter 12A and matter 6 and matter 14 as well, which is later this week. So is that Mr. Shadaravian, please?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much. We were very surprised and very disappointed to receive Highways England's response. We don't agree with it. And I'll give you an example. Suggested in paragraph 1.3 of the report that on initial examination, the evidence as presented indicates that by the end of the local plan period, in 2035, the M25 would have insufficient capacity to accommodate forecast traffic flows, even without the addition of local plan development related traffic. The TA does not draw that conclusion. The data, the Highways England data was requested to provide the base for assessment that was acceptable both to Highways England and Essex County Council. And Highways England, so far as I understand it, have been present at all meetings when this was discussed. It was agreed that we would use the data supplied by the Junction 28 team for the A12 junction and Lower Thames crossing data at Junction 29. This information was used by Stantec in good faith, and each junction was modelled independently as sourced from separate models. And we assumed, as both schemes were approaching DCO examination, that Highways England were content that the information is or was appropriate and compatible. There are various other matters in the statement from Highways England that disappoint us. This means inevitably that we are going to have to continue discussions with Highways England to get to the bottom of this, and that's going to take a little time. And until we can be certain as to the differences between us and the reasons for them, if there are any actually at the end of the day, we are not able appropriately to examine matters which are dependent upon an assessment of those outcomes and their implications for other policies in the plan. and the allocations. So we are going to need time to discuss these matters with Highways England. I hope subject to a strict timetable so that we do not lose our way in this examination, endlessly going backwards and forwards with more and more data sets and misunderstandings. So we have done our utmost to accommodate Highways England. We are confused as to why we are in this position at this moment in time, but we do need time to sit down with Highways England to discuss the implications of their current representations and how they might be resolved.
And from the council's perspective, what does that mean when you say the implications for discussions on matters relating to the Highways England letter? And what, in relation to the agenda that we've set for today, what do you consider can or cannot be discussed today because of waiting for those discussions with Highways England?
Well, obviously we need to understand the nature of the improvements which are required. We thought we knew what they were. We believe that we do know what they are, but we need to understand what they are and what their related costs are, and what timescales are involved in their provision. That will may have implications. We don't think it will, but it may have implications for viability and infrastructure delivery. It doesn't affect our discussion of those matters itemised under 2 and 3, which is the discussion of policies, BE 11, 12 to 16 and 17. It may well impact on air quality. So really it's all those matters which are itemised in issue 1, the transport infrastructure assessment, impacts and provisions, what is needed where and when and how will it be delivered. Those essentially are the matters which are impacted by this current situation.
Okay, thank you. If I can come to Highways England, so Ms. Burgess, is there anything you at the moment, I know you need to, the council has said that they need to discuss matters with you in relation to the comments that you've sent in response to the updated transport assessment. Is there anything that you want to add to that discussion, to what's been said by the council at the moment in relation to what can and can't be discussed today from Highways England perspective?
Thank you, ma'am. No, I think that what I would say in response is that 1.3 very clearly says on initial examination. So I think that was setting into context something that we were looking at in the very early days. But the rest of our statement then goes on to explain the things that we have done subsequent to that. I have, since we've submitted that statement, or in fact at the end of last week, I've already had discussions with Mr. Drain over setting up a new series of meetings, and we do intend initially to have meetings once a week to carry on those discussions that we have had. So I see that, you know, we will be progressing these matters over a series of weeks. I was a little bit concerned about the comment that was made just then about the fact that they thought they knew what improvements were coming forward, because we have already been notified that there are alternatives being discussed at the moment about certainly improvements at junction 29. So I don't think that we can say that there is an agreed position there on those mitigations. If there's anything that we want to talk about specifically in our written statement, then I'm more than happy for Mr. Walton to have that discussion today, as we will be doing subsequently.
Thank you, Ms. Burgess. Mr. Shadaravian, is there any merit in having that discussion at the moment, or is it something that the council needs to go away and discuss with your transport experts as well.
The simple matter is, ma'am, that if we undertake those discussions in a live examination, it's not going to be fruitful because we need to interrogate Highways England's position constructively to meet and identify a timetable within which these matters can be resolved satisfactorily, so that the final position can be presented to you and Mr. Walden to enable this plan to proceed on an orderly basis.
Thank you. We have representatives in the room from who on sustainable transport measures, for instance, so cycleways, etc. So I would like to just understand from the council's perspective whether there would be some merit this morning, as we have some people present, for discussing some sustainable transport measures, with the understanding that whether what Highways England and what yourself come out with in relation to the future discussions that you're going to be having with Highways England, having any implications for sustainable transport measures.
Ma'am, I suggest that will be very useful.
Okay.
If there's anything about these discussions which is impacted by this current impasse, then we can always put those to one side.
Okay. What I would like to do, because I would like to speak to my colleague in private before we continue, can I suggest we just have a 15-minute adjournment so that I can have that discussion with Mr. Warden, and then we will come back and hold, we will make it very clear as to what we will be discussing, what we won't be discussing just this morning. It will be a shortened session, but we will have some discussions.
Very
okay,
good, thank you.
So if we can be back, it's if we can be back at can we say 10:05, please?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Very short adjournment there, but that was a very useful one. I could talk things through with my colleague. Now, what we would like to do is we would like to just go through our agenda and just highlight the areas where we think we can continue discussions today, and the areas where we don't think we can. Before I do that, though, I would like the council to provide us with a clear timetable by the end of this week, please. But so by preferably 12 noon on Friday, so it gives us a chance to actually look at it in the afternoon and get back to the council on anything. If that clear timetable can set out obviously in conjunction with your discussions with Highways England, the clear steps and what it is that you need to do in clear stages, and if you can clearly show either where there is agreement and where there is differences when you come about to have your discussions, because we need to have confidence moving forward that whatever the timetable is for having these additional discussions and producing any additional evidence or not, as the case may be. As I said, the council has said there may not be a difference, there may be. We need to have confidence in moving this examination forward that things aren't going to change again in relation to transport. We need an actual point where we can just go, okay, this is what is required in relation to the strategic transport infrastructure requirements, the measures that need to go in place, the mitigation, etc. We need to be very clear on that and very confident, and not just ourselves, but members of the public, local residents that are watching this. They need to be very confident that the situation has been appropriately assessed, etc. So if the council, in conjunction with the Highways England, can come up with a clear, very specific, very with all the points set out as to what needs to be done by when and how it's going to be done, that would be very, very helpful in moving forward. Thank you. Now, I was just going to go through the agenda, but Mr. Axon, you've got your hand up. So
yes. Thank you, ma'am. Given what you've just said, if you like, this is an offer from CEG. We have a functioning, working microsimulation model for part of the network that is the subject of this discussion. And it's a model that Highways England are familiar with because they have approved the base model. Their consultants have approved that. So the offer that we make, ma'am, is that we're prepared to provide or work with Highways England, Brentwood and Essex using that model, if that is helpful to the authorities, if that helps to speed up the process or provide more confidence in the answers. So that's an offer we're prepared to make, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Axon. Council, would you like to just respond on that, Mr. Shadragian?
It may be helpful. I don't know at the moment. I wouldn't like to speculate, but certainly if it proves to be useful, then certainly we would take up that offer. But we need to discuss it first of all with Highways England.
Thank you. Thank you for that offer, Mr. Axon. So we won't be discussing today. Well, out of point 1 on our agenda, I'd like to still discuss sustainable transport infrastructure measures, including the park, ride and stride element, but the rest of it, of agenda item 1, we won't be discussing today. So it's only those 2 points. And then I would like to discuss agenda items 2 to 4. And then as for item 5, I fully understand that air quality and transport, particularly highways, is very much interlinked in Brentwood. So I'm happy to, or I'm content to move that to a later session to discuss that. because it will be dependent upon the discussions that will happen with Highways England and whether there are any implications. But I would just like to say on that point that the existing baseline is sort of clearly set out in the council's evidence, but I'm finding it very difficult to find sort of the predicted future sort of forecasting or predictions as to what air quality will be like. And it's very much a prediction at the end of the planned period based on the proposed planned growth and the mitigation measures that should be in place at that time, and what the cumulative impacts of development is on certain areas, etc. A lot of the evidence that you've provided is in relation to the air quality management areas. But obviously that's the situation now. So I'd just like to understand in a bit more detail where that will be in the future. So I'm not proposing to have any discussions on air quality today. I think it is right to leave that because there could be implications from the strategic highway network discussions that will be occurring. But if the council can just take on board those comments and the agenda items that are set out on this agenda, and we will move those forward to other points. So is the council content with the way forward this morning?
We are, Mum. Thank you very much indeed. It's been extremely helpful.
Okay, can we move on then to just look at sustainable transport? So we will be looking at the transport assessment. And I know there could be implications because I suppose that's what we wish to understand. Oh, Mr. Warden, please.
Thank you, Mrs. Wright. So just let me understand, the council are content with that timetable that we just set out in terms of information we need. But can Highways England please confirm that is acceptable to them as well in terms of what we just asked for?
Yes, sorry, I've had to dial in by telephone, so I hope everybody can hear me. Yes, Highways England are content with that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Wright.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Warden. So it may be useful now if Highways England is still on the call, but if Highways England and some of the council's team members wish to come off the call and start those discussions or come away from this meeting, then obviously you're more than welcome to leave and start that momentum of producing this timetable. I don't think we'll be having a very long discussion, but it's going to be probably around an hour or so on sustainable transport measures. So if, because there are some queries and questions that we've got on those elements. So if anybody does wish to leave in relation to Highways England or any other participants, obviously, because we're not going to be dealing with highways matters today, then please do so. Okay. So what I would like to move on to is, and just bear with me while I just get the document up, is I want to move on to just look at some of the sustainable transport. So we're looking at sustainable transport rather than the strategic transport elements, which mainly involves highways that are set out within the transport assessment, and then that are and what is and is not set out within the actual plan itself. And then we'll look at the policies themselves, and then we'll finish the session. So depending on where we get, we may have hold another break mid-morning, but we'll see how we go with that. So transport assessment sets out, excuse me, a package of measures, and it highlights these within the transport assessment. And there is a very useful table set out on page 21 of the transport assessment, which sets out sustainable transport measures, a number of these. I suppose my first question is to the council to just understand, these are measures, these were sort of potential, or are these definitive measures? Are they, because what is in the plan and what's not in the plan? Because I'm a little bit confused to try and determine what sustainable transport measures are absolutely critical, and none of them are critical in terms of, or the vast majority are not critical in the IDP in terms of they're not a priority one in the IDP. The vast majority of priority one, and excluding the West Horndon interchange, which we'll be coming on to shortly, the vast majority of these measures, so either cycleway measures and some pedestrian measures, etc., aren't critical, as in they're not priority one in the IDP. So they're not considered to be strategic transport infrastructure, because the council and your policy BE11 are proposing changes to make it clear what is a strategic transport infrastructure. So I'm just trying to understand then where in the plan, and I know certain elements are set out within site allocations, but where in the plan are the sustainable transport measures clearly set out? And what is, because I'm trying to understand what is absolutely required to deliver the plan, the planned growth. So if the council could just explain or just run through it, or whether it's your Stantec experts, etc., whether they can just run through the process that was gone through to come up with the sustainable transport measures. I think that would be a good starting point, please.
In terms of the where in the plan these are set out, I would like to point you to policy BE13, sustainable means of travel and walkable streets, and then policy BE16. Give me 1 second. That's mitigating the transport impacts of development. These policies set out the requirements that development should provide sustainable transport measures or contributions to those that were identified in the IDP. And these two policies also should be read in conjunction with policy SP04, which is more specific about the financial contributions or on-site, off-site contributions. In SP04 as well, as we mentioned earlier in the other hearing sessions, we will provide some more clarity in terms of reference to the IDP, where these sustainable transport measures will be set out, for example, and reference to the relevant policies in the plan where commuted sums to the measures would be set out.
I think I suppose what I'm struggling with is it's not clear to me within the plan what strategic infrastructure, whether it's sustainable or whether it's highways, for instance, is necessary to bring forward the planned growth, and where in the policies that is set, those specific improvements or measures are set out in policy. So, for instance, you've just pointed me to general development management policies. So, quite rightly so, you've got general development policy on BE13, and then you've got BE16. But for instance, the sustainable transport measures in the plan refer to creating a school clear zone, delivering park, ride or stride facilities. There's plan and deliver in phases, quiet way, cycle routes, etc. But that's, well, can you point me to where those specific measures are in policy within the plan?
It is listed under the supporting text of policy BE16, mitigating the transport impacts of development, and it's specifically listed under paragraph 5.131.
But it's not in the policy though, is it?
It's not. The idea is that these items are listed in the IDP, and the IDP would be kept as a live document, as a snapshot in time, as in these are the mitigation measures that we know based on the available informations. And as we go forward, these may be updated to reflect the dwelling quantums that comes forward as part of the development on site, and as part of conversations with Essex Highways and Highways England, for example.
If measures are required for particular site allocations, then I know that then particular details and requirements are set out in some of the site allocations. But is that detailed enough to bring forward specific measures that are absolutely necessary to ensure that sustainable transport elements are appropriate, are absolutely delivered? Because I'm trying to. So, I'm trying not to refer to site allocations, because we're not discussing site allocations today. That's not the purpose of today at all, and we're not going to be discussing specifics on that at all. But for instance, if it's an absolute requirement that park, ride, or stride facilities are provided, because that's part of your strategy to bring forward the planned growth, why are they not allocated in the plan?
These, in terms of these sustainable measures that are not category 1 or 2, we envisage that these would be funded by SIL, and because they don't have to be absolutely delivered prior to development commencement. So, since the council will be progressing SIL following the adoption, also, these sustainable transport measure will also benefit all developments in the borough rather than just the site allocation. We think that it would be more appropriate for all development, regardless of the, not just the site allocations, to be contributing to them. And also because of the time frame, as I mentioned. Therefore, we think that they would be more appropriate to be funded by SIL, and that therefore they are not in the site allocation, to give us that flexibility as well to develop these further.
And can you just remind me? I know it's in your LDS. I haven't got that document up, but can you just remind me your timetable for producing SIL, please?
Indicatively, it would be following the plan of adoption, but yeah, I got a note from my colleagues. So
yeah, but timetable. How long will it take to actually get a SIL in place?
Probably once the plan is adopted, work will start on it, and there's only one consultation required now, so we're anticipating it will take about a year after adoption of the plan.
So there could be a number of, there could potentially be a number of allocations that could get through planning application before that comes in. So therefore, if that wouldn't be, or certain elements wouldn't be put in as part of any Section 106 requirements,
unless there was,
if it's not set out in policy.
Well, not everything needs to be set out in policy.
No,
a lot of this stuff actually is behavioural. There are matters which can be applied generically across several or more developments, and they are things that can be funded through SIL and don't need to be in place at the outset of development. So, for example, creating a school clear zone to restrict vehicles from stopping or parking is not a matter which needs to be part of a policy. These are matters which can be dealt with borough level by the local authority. Deliver park, ride or stride facilities, ditto. as it says in the comment here, impact on local traffic patterns would need to be understood, work needed with schools to re-educate parents. See, these are all behavioural matters. So the list of items here in table 3.1 are laudable objectives which need to be brought about through the influence of the local authority, and where necessary for the local authority to provide that infrastructure to improve sustainability. So far as measures on a site-by-site basis are concerned, they are dealt with at a higher level in the policies. But there is nothing about the lack of reference of these matters in the policy which would prevent them coming about through the intervention of the local planning authority or the borough at a higher level.
Sorry, if I can just, because I want to move on shortly, because I don't want to labour the point too much, but I am just trying to understand from what's been set out in the transport assessment and what's set out in the plan, how important the sustainable transport measures are in dealing with, in general terms. I know we need to get down to some of the specifics, so particularly I want to look at West Horndon, the interchange hub that's proposed. How important are they in terms of mitigating the increased traffic and mitigating potential increased air quality?
You can do it.
Is that a question?
That was a question, yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, well, that was a question. It might not have been clear as a question, but it was a question. I'm just trying to understand how important are these sustainable transport measures? Because there is in transport, there is a hierarchy of transport. Walking is at the top, then it's cycling, then it sort of comes down to passenger transport, then right at the bottom is going to be cars. So I'm trying to understand whether that is clearly set out within the plan and how important these sustainable transport measures are. And you certainly make it very clear for the West Horndon interchange hub. That's a priority one in the IDP. That's got to come forward. You've made that very clear, and we'll move on to discuss that. It's the other measures which are which I know are set out within the site allocations, that there must be cycle connection, there must be appropriate clear walking, pedestrian routes, etc., etc. So I'm just trying to understand whether there is any need for anything else to be set out in actual policy in relation to the specifics, whether a hierarchy needs to be set out. I have seen that in policies before. I'm not saying that's absolutely essential here, but I'm just trying to get some clarity on how important these measures are in the plan.
Ma'am, if I might, it's David Ubaka here, and I shall turn on my video as per.
Yes, please. Thank you.
So you can see who I am. I've been leading on this for the council, and we are, as a team, in terms of sustainable transport, it is a huge priority for us, and they have had an impact on mitigating some of the flows at the junctions. We've been having intense discussions with Essex Highways, and I'll bring my colleagues from Stantec in a minute to maybe go over a bit of detail how we've applied some of sustainable measures to fix some of the junctions that Essex felt were still slightly over capacity. But with regards to the sustainable measures generally within the borough, it is the aspiration of the council, and it is the wish of the council to have a modal shift away from car to really start to focus on people being able to walk and to cycle within the various villages that make up the borough. To do that, we will need time. We will need consultations with locals, and therefore I think it's appropriate that those measures are shown as they're shown currently, because while some mitigations have a factor that's been applied on some junctions, our colleagues at Essex were very keen for us not to make them primary at this point, because they're going to fit into a larger strategy to deal with some very difficult junctions within the borough.
So you want an element, so the plan is allowing an element of flexibility in terms of bringing forward sustainable transport measures. Is that what you're saying? And that's appropriate for Brentwood? It
is, yes. And because also the generalised costs of, say, implementing sustainable transport measures like a legible London walking system are relatively cheap compared to just delivering a physical change at a junction. And therefore it was felt that we could allow that flexibility in time because of the cost implications not being as onerous to developments, and therefore not having the impact on viability that, say, a physical change to a junction would have. And it allowed us, therefore, to make sure we can work with our county colleagues to coordinate the thought process and make sure we were delivering all of these measures in the most appropriate way that would be acceptable to all, both politically and members of the community.
Thank you. Thank you. That's been very useful. Thank you. I'm going to bring in I've got a number of hands up. I will bring in my colleague first, so Mr. Warden, and then I will go down my list. So Mr. Warden, please.
Thank you, Mrs. Wright. Mr. Barker may have actually answered the question that I've got. It isn't about the policy, but it's about whether those measures set out in the transport assessment actually have been assumed as being interventions in the transport modelling. So how critical are they in terms of the transport modelling?
Thank you, Inspector. The question, it's a good question. With regards to the transport modelling, obviously we need to deal with the worst case impacts of vehicular traffic. It is an old system, but it's a system we still need to use. And because we've done that, that's one of the reasons we've kept sustainable measures as a flexible thing, because we had to respond to our Essex colleagues on the vehicular impacts on the highways, as it were. But they are important, because where Brentwood stands is that while we have complied with the technical requirement to show the absolute worst case scenario impacts on the highway network, it is our aspiration and our intention to make primary the delivery of the sustainable measures, so that worst case scenario is actually never reached.
Thank you.
Can I bring in Mr. Robinson from the County Council, please, and then I'll go to other participants.
Thank you, Inspector. Just to make clear Essex County Council's position about the listed interventions in the transport assessment.
Oh, you've gone on to mute, Mr. Robinson.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Rogue cursor. We agree with the transport assessment's assertion that a package of sustainable interventions are needed. We do have some reservations about the specific measures that have been listed in the plan. Therefore, the flexibility around what those measures actually turn out to be is welcomed from our perspective. So I think that was all I wanted to say. Some of it has been covered already by other answers.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. Can I bring in Mr. Minot, please?
Yes, thank you, Inspector. I mean, I think this goes to the heart of the problems that the concerns that I have in relation to what's being proposed in terms of the town centre. I mean, I think the question that you asked just now, how important are the sustainable transport measures in mitigating increased traffic and mitigating the air quality problems? I mean, the point is that the transport assessment makes it absolutely clear that for a number of town centre junctions, there are no junction improvements being proposed, and the entire explanation that the worrying figures in terms of the capacity problems in town centre junctions can be ignored, can be set aside, relies on the idea that there's going to be modal shift, there's going to be sustainable transport solutions. So the justifiability of development impacting those junctions entirely relies on sustainable transport implications or sustainable transport assumptions. But when you look at the transport assessment, I have to say you look in vain for clarity or certainty that those measures will actually happen. I mean, I think there's a gigantic credibility gap where sustainable measures are concerned, as far as the transport assessment is concerned, and as far as the council's positions have over several years now have been concerned. I have had the concern that you were effectively expressing just now, because of the fact that, I won't talk about specific sites, but the cumulative effect of town centre site allocations will have in the town centre, which you can't separate out from one another, because all the traffic from all of those sites will be on the same roads going through the same junctions. If you don't have policies in place right at the beginning, people will try and get in under the wire. They will try and get their applications in, get past that process, not have to make any contributions, because there's nothing from the council requiring contributions. I mean, we're in a situation now where there's actually 2 specific sites in the town centre where we've already had planning applications in advance of the local plan being adopted, or even properly discussed by you as inspectors. And I have to say, you look at, well, there's 2 things. One thing I'd like to really highlight is what is being said in the transport assessment at 3.1.6, where it says that sustainable travel ideas have not been explicitly modelled as part of the assessment, but such measures should bring about changes required to support delivery of the local plan. So the transport assessment is essentially not showing, and cannot show because it hasn't investigated, what the consequences of the measures that it's talking about will be. So I think that's a fundamental failing. We need to have a clear assessment of that in order to say some of the sites which are being talked about and the pressure which will be put on the infrastructure is justifiable and can be sustained. You then look at the specific sustainable transport measures which are listed, and I have to say they just don't look plausible to me in the real world. And I think I don't want to put words into his mouth. I'm sure he would say things in a very different way. But what Mr. Robinson's just said suggests that Essex County Council, as the Highways Authority, are looking at some of these and thinking, well, maybe that might work. Maybe there's another thing that could be done. I just don't see these things which are being listed as deliverable in the real world. I mean, the whole school clear zone, if you look at the Appendix A map for the school clear zone, this covers, I mean, I don't know how many square miles it is, but it's a huge area. Most of central Brentwood, most of central Shenfield. It would need to be policed. You'd need to have traffic wardens to police it. You'd need to have signs up. We're just, in terms of traffic wardens, we're currently in a situation where at the very times where the peak traffic movements occur, particularly the morning peak, but also the afternoon peak for schools, the traffic wardens will avoid the areas where the schools are because of the levels of hostility and aggression that they're getting. So we're effectively not having these things policed at all. So we have just ridiculous, nightmarish problems. In my own ward in Sawyers Hall Lane, where we have 5 or 6 schools, depending on how you count things, in the same road, which is a dead-end road. I just don't believe that. I mean, I'd love it. All of these things, I would absolutely love them to happen. Completely in favour of them. I'd love them to happen. I just don't believe that in the real world they're going to work. You look at Park Ride and Stride. Okay, the Appendix A maps talks about the Brentwood Centre and King George's Park. You can't put extra parking in King George's Park. There'd be an absolute outcry. There's an outcry of what's being talked about there at the moment. Parking spaces are a premium there. Brentwood Centre, the only way you access the town centre or the schools, you have to walk up dangerous narrow paths. You have to come through junctions which are already problematic in the local plan. If you look at the quiet ways which are being described, and again the the map in Appendix A, you've got a quiet way route coming down from the north to central Brentwood, which runs along Doddinghurst Road, Western Avenue. Those are places where you've got very narrow paths. You've got dangerous paths because they've got steep slopes on them. You don't have capacity on the paths. You've got the need to cross roads where there aren't good road crossings. You've got traffic islands which are in the middle of A roads. No zebra crossings, for instance, to get across from the end of there is a zebra crossing, but it doesn't take you in the right direction from the end of Doddinghurst Road. You've got a freight vehicle, HDV vehicle ban which is being proposed. So you can't load or unload, but you're talking about, look at Brentwood High Street, you're talking about banning people from loading or unloading, but on an A road where you can't stop the vehicles from coming through. So the vehicles will be able to come through because it's an A road, there aren't alternative routes. How do you stop them from stopping? How do you stop them from loading or unloading? Who's going to be policing all of this? This will be a massive job. Things like the pedestrian wayfinding system, great if you're going to put up some more signs, but we're talking about an attempt to create a modal shift. As I said, when I was talking about one of the previous issues, central government seems to not believe that a modal shift is going to happen in terms of various transport journeys, and I haven't seen any evidence that Brentwood Council has presented a guaranteed fact that modal shift will genuinely occur. I mean, the laudable objectives that Mr. Shedrevin is talking about, they are absolutely laudable. This is, I would love to see these things happen. The trouble is, when they're only laudable objectives, when we haven't seen the evidence, when we can't see the sequence, and I think there's a huge sequence issue here, which goes back to this point about it not being policy and people getting in under the wire. Where is the guarantee that these things will work? I mean, the transport assessment effectively says this works for these junctions, irrespective of the figures that you can see from their own modelling of the junctions, because of the sustainable transport measures. But how do you show that the sustainable transport measures will actually happen, will actually work? And some of the things that are being talked about, you've got proposals in terms of the Wilson's Corner junction, where you're suddenly talking about, new gyratory systems, one-way systems, funneling huge amounts of traffic, 400 and 500 vehicle movements of traffic on each lane into junctions which were never designed to take them. None of the town centre junctions were designed to take enormous amounts of traffic. These proposals are coming along at a last minute. They haven't been discussed locally. They haven't been, as far as I can tell, assessed locally. I just think there's impracticality everywhere. There's lack of clarity everywhere. There's lack of credibility everywhere. I could go on for longer. I can always go on for longer, but I might come back on certain things. But as far as I'm concerned, this is a huge issue. And like I say, just to go back to the point, from my point of view, I would love this. I would love to live in the world where all of these things are possible. I personally don't have a car. That's why I live in the middle of Brentwood. I wish everybody was like me. They're not. How do we make this work? And I see nothing in the plan that's showing how we do it.
Thank you, Mr. Minot. I'm going to move on to Mr. Fletcher, and then I'll come to Ms. Webster, and then I'll come to the council for a response. Thank you. Mr. Fletcher, please.
Thank you. I feared a short while ago we were going to go down a policy wormhole, but I wanted to try and put things in context and mirror some of the things that Philip was just stating. I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but Brentwood has got the second lowest rate of cycle commuting in the whole of Essex at less than 1%, which is a disgrace as far as I'm concerned. It's got probably the sparsest, least coherent cycle network, not just in Essex, but in the unitary authorities and our neighbouring East London boroughs. The cycle paths that do exist, which are very, very few, they're incomplete. They typically end with no onward connection, such as the ones on Ongar Road and Shenfield Road. We have a Brentwood Cycle Action Plan, originally written, I believe, in 2014, updated in 2018. There are 14 key recommendations in that document. Of those, and this has been out now for over 2 years, only one is actually in progress, and that's the updating of cycle maps, which we've been involved in. And one has been given the go-ahead, but only because of the COVID emergency fund. And without that, that wouldn't have happened either. Now, I know it's a plan, but it hasn't happened. As far as we're aware, there are no committed cycle infrastructure actions at all related to the current planned developments. And pushing SIL back by another 2 to 3 years, or however long it's going to be, means those developments are going to go ahead without any of the active travel links. And finally, what's most frustrating for us is that so many significant improvements could be made at relatively low cost just by signing and marking the quiet routes on existing roads. At the moment, there is practically no cycle signage or marking of the routes that are designated on the cycle map. If you look at the cycle map, very few of those actually exist on the ground. So I just want to put that in context. So when we talk about policies, we should realise that whatever the policies have been up to now, they have not been delivering. Thank you.
So, Mr. Fletcher, what would you like to see in the plan in terms of policy, written in policy?
I would like to see, certainly the issue we understand is around the funding. We need to ensure that money is diverted from the various developments, by whatever means, and you're the experts in that, to actually put into some of these things into the ground. And the focus tends to be on these grand scale projects, major east, west and north south links, whereas a lot could be achieved locally. I'd like to see a prioritization on the local links, the signage of quiet routes, which just require a few junction changes rather than wholesale segregated cycle lanes, which are great if we can do them, but we all realise that getting money for those is going to be a step in the future. So nothing has happened recently in terms of all the local routes that could be signed, minor infrastructure changes that could get people actually moving around, even just the town centre, if not beyond.
Thank you, Mr. Fletcher. I'll come to Ms. Webster now, please, and then I'll go to the council. Oh, and I've got Mr. Axon as well. I'll come to Mr. Axon after Ms. Webster. Sorry.
I would like to say that I support a lot of the comments that Phil Minot has made. I agree with him that looking at the sustainable transport measures, they're very aspirational, but not really very viable or credible as producing the result that's expected. I won't go into details because I think Mr. Minot's already covered a lot of that. I think that one of the concerns I have is that the report in C28 on sustainable transport summarises quite well that one of the problems Brentwood has is the design of the town, with very large areas of the town blocked off from public access because they're owned but privately, such as the school areas. But the concentration of infrastructure items such as schools with very small roads makes mitigation efforts impossible in most of the cases in the town centre, which is why we have significant transport. I don't think that the proposals will produce the modal shift expected. And with regard to the modelling, from reading the modelling appendices and all the various, there are so many reports, but that I understand that they are not really based on solely the worst case scenario, because the worst case scenario would be that there was no shift away. But there has been a credit taken in the traffic modelling for the future transport planning for a reduction in traffic due to modal shifts. But I don't think the council has provided any evidence that that actually will happen. And so maybe the transport assessments actually underestimate the future congestion in the town. Maybe this is because I'm not, I'm a resident and I don't really understand, but one of the most obvious mitigation effects, mitigation policies would be to review whether, if your infrastructure is being demonstrated to reach capacity, if that is a priority, then maybe you should be looking at whether your allocation sites are correctly located, and that whether maybe you're just trying to pour a quart into a pint pot in the case of Brentwood. And so we should be reviewing if in fact the infrastructure is not there to support the population and housing growth that the plan is trying to deliver.
Thank you, Ms. Webster. I will bring in Mr. Axon and then I'll go to the council. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. What I'd like to say is that we support the flexible approach to sustainable transport that the council is proposing on their sort of monitor and evaluate basis, because that's the way sustainable transport actually works best. I'd just like to say one or two things in addition to that. It's not the unique purpose of the sustainable transport measures to mitigate traffic. It's actually the purpose of sustainable transport measures, particularly in a local plan, to promote the health and well-being, lifestyle and carbon emission reductions. And that's something that's set out clearly in the Chartered Institute of Highway Transportation advice on local plans. In fact, what they say is we must fully abandon the predict and provide models of transport planning and assess the local plan against health, lifestyle and carbon emissions. And that's what I believe the council is trying to do here. So it's not a case of trying to rely upon sustainable measures to effect a mode shift that reduces traffic, because in the end, traffic is a function of the road space that exists for it. That's a fundamental rule of transport planning. So we need the sustainable measures anyway, for those very good reasons. And we can't, I'm afraid, assume that the sustainable measures are not going to have any effect either. To assume that they're not going to have any effect inherently assumes that national policy on health and carbon will fail. And that's not a reasonable proposition. Also, it's not reasonable to design infrastructure based on previously predicted needs. That's something else that comes out in some of the guidance, rather than meeting and shaping the transport needs of the future. So what this local plan does is it does look at meeting and shaping the transport needs of the future, rather than simply going backwards to previously predicted needs and designing on that basis. So all that told, the monitor and evaluate process that effectively the council is promoting within the policies within the local plan is something that we support, and we say it almost has to happen that way in order to get the best advantage out of the changing design and fluctuating attitudes to sustainable and healthy movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Axon. Council, would you like to respond to some of the points that have been raised?
Yes, ma'am. Let's go back to the beginning, to the points you raised initially about whether or not these measures should be incorporated in policies. You will be aware of what BE16 says. It's been redrafted, and I think there's still some grammar that needs to be corrected, but nonetheless, in Part B of BE16, it says where necessary, reasonable and proportionate financial contributions and all mitigation measures to mitigate the transport impacts of the development to an acceptable degree. Then it goes on to say this could include investment in infrastructure services, low emission zone or behavioural change measures, including enforcement to encourage the use of sustainable modes of transport. Such measures should be provided to meet the first or early occupation of a site in order to influence travel behaviour from the outset. Now that might be better worded, just to firm it up a little bit, but quite clearly that envisages behavioural change measures, which could include one or more of the measures in this table, if appropriate to that particular development. What's essential is that proposed developments are designed in such a way that they minimise reliance upon the use of the motor car, encourage healthy lifestyles, and of course the policies do provide for that, whether the generic policy approach or looking at site-specific measures in relation to particular developments. And if one looks at the table, one can see the types of things in items 1 to 7 that are really behavioural or rely upon interventions at a higher level, which developments ought to be able to facilitate in terms of their design. And that's a matter which the local authority and the local highways authority can oversee when assessing applications. There is the policy framework to do that. so far as measures 8 and 9 are concerned, introduce electrical parking points, etc., those will be requirements of individual developments where they either have public parking or private parking. Item 9, which is the West Hornland Station, I won't address at this moment in time. But just going back over all of these items, we can see in the comment column how these interventions might be brought about, identifying also the issues implicit in trying to bring them about. So, for example, number 2, deliver park and ride or stride facilities for workers within Brentwood town centre. It says impact on local traffic patterns would need to be understood. Work needed with schools to re-educate parents, consider an electric ordinary bicycle hire scheme hub. So these are interventions which can be brought about by the use of other measures than policies in this plan. They are extra measures which, combined with the policies, will bring about these changes in behaviour, or hopefully will do so over the life of the plan and beyond.
Thank you. Mr. Minot, did you want to add anything to the comments that you've made?
Yeah, I don't want to go on for very long, but I just wanted to be a bit specific in terms of some of the things that are actually being said in the transport assessment, in terms of some of the junctions that are being talked about. If you look at 4.8.3, it's being said that a pragmatic view is taken as to whether physical highway mitigation is the best way forward, or whether more emphasis should be put on the provision of sustainable transport measures and consideration of changing travel behaviour as outlined in section 1. This is the case for many of the junctions within Brentwood Town Centre. You've got a list of junctions: junction 2, junction 3, junction 7, junction 27. 27 is obviously not Town Centre. The other ones are either Brentwood or Shenfield Town Centre, or the A1023 running between the two of them. The junction 3 and junction 7, the Ongar Road, Dodinghurst Road junction, and the Ingrove Road, Queens Road junction, both of those, in terms of the transport assessment's own figures, are read in the baseline, let alone the reference figures, and let alone the reference plus the LDP figures. So these are junctions with really serious problems. And when you look at the paragraphs further down in 4.8, those junctions are covered specifically, and in each case it goes through and says that it's going to be possible to reduce traffic because of sustainable measures, and no further mitigation is required. You look at a junction like Wilson's Corner. I mean, we could spend ages on Wilson's Corner, but I won't. There's a whole host of things there where it's essentially saying more work alongside Essex County Council will be required to identify strategic solutions. There's a claim that all the figures which look frightening in terms of wait times, in terms of the delays at that junction, will all be fine, because in practice, people won't use that junction because they will realise that they don't want to be there. So what's happened in terms of how that will affect other nearby junctions? A perfect example would be junction 10. The High Street Kings Road Wild Road junction. When you look at what the transport assessment says about junction 10, it's still trying to claim that the worst case scenario 5.7.1 looks at junction 1, looks at junction 10, junction 18, junction 17, and it simply assumes that the worst case won't happen. In other words, it tries to see what's projected simply for that junction. It assumes it won't happen. It's quote unquote, it is likely that the demand at the junctions will be less than the forecast. Well, if people are not going to be using Wilson's Corner because of absurd delay times, which just to say, the local plan delay times are 508% of the baseline delay in one case, 429% of the day's baseline decay in another delay in another case. There's serious issues here. There's no acknowledgement when you look at anything that transport assessment says in terms of junction 10, that people might think, oh, well, I won't use that junction. I'll go to the other end of the high street because I want to go west. So I will be coming therefore through junction 10. So traffic will be moving from one junction to another. There's been an attempt to model the Wilson's Corner, Sawyers Hall Lane, Highland Avenue, Burland Road system, which works as a little one-way system, there hasn't been any serious attempt to say these will be the knock-on consequences. So there are some absolutely specific things here. If you look at what the transport assessment says and you take its word, it is essentially saying this is how it's going to work. There aren't any further mitigation measures. It's going to be happening. It's going to work, if it works at all, through sustainable measures. But then there's no evidence that the sustainable measures will work. That's my opinion, and that's effectively what I get from reading the council's own documents.
Thank you, Mr. Minot. Can I come to the council for a response? There's quite a few speakers there.
Yeah,
You've had a chance to have their say. Anything you want to respond on?
Could I I was going to add to my last response to you in relation to B16, that we could make it clearer in the policy that the design of proposals needs to, wherever possible and appropriate, to facilitate or provide opportunities for measures like this to be brought about, and we could make a reference in the supporting text to the type of measures by reference to a table similar to this. So B16 would provide the opportunity for the local authority to say, look, this development in this location, you could assist us with this particular sustainable transport measure. Can we put these measures in here as a means of facilitating a borough-wide approach? It's just a suggestion at this point.
It's something we can obviously have a look at. I don't like the word facilitate because that doesn't mean anything. It's about what is required. I understand that the council is saying this needs flexibility, but it's about setting out what is required so that developers are very clear as to what is expected from them in terms of sustainable transport requirements, and that in relation to allocations, that's set out within the allocations, but in relation to any other windfall development or anything else that comes forward, it's exactly what would be expected from developers to come forward. So it's made very clear. It doesn't have to specify particular projects or anything like that, but it's just ensuring that the wording provides that effectiveness. I think we just need to look at that wording.
I can certainly do that, and I will avoid using the word facilitate more.
Thank you. I understand what you're saying about trying to provide opportunities, but it's about just being clearer. I think that's what the policy requires. Thank you for that. Anything further you want to add, Mr. Shadaravian?
No, Ma'am, thank you very much.
Okay.
Inspector, shall I come back on some of the points that have been raised?
Yes, please.
I'll do my best to cover some of the key ones. I think, we could get in depth on some of the things that have been mentioned about the way in which calculations have been made at particular junctions, and I can bring in colleagues if that's helpful to sort of work through. As you'll know, and as we've set out through the sessions, there's been a huge amount of work over a long period of time with County Council and Highways England colleagues indeed, and we've found out this morning that more is needed with Highways England, but certainly from a local perspective with County Council colleagues. We've looked in depth at the way in which the transport assessment models growth and considers junctions, and I believe that whilst there may clearly be ongoing needs to monitor and review the impacts of growth, we're in a position now with County to be able to say that we understand broadly what those impacts are and where mitigation is required, and indeed where mitigation is possible, in the sense that I think we've had various people correctly identify that Brentwood, as a historic town, like many other towns across the country, is limited in its capacity and capability of huge amounts of physical mitigation at particular junctions in order to accommodate traffic flows. And so naturally, we end up with situations at peak times, and I'd stress we're talking about peak times, where traffic is longer than we would like. and therefore, as has been identified, there are some cases where in the baseline at existing times we have junctions that are at or near capacity. So we've tried our best to think about the way in which growth can be accommodated within that context. And indeed, sustainable transport measures are considered from the perspective of where that can help with that type of thing, where physical mitigation is just not going to be possible, viable, in terms of what may need to be done to completely solve the situation. However, it is within the context of the fact that the transport assessment applies a worst case scenario, whereby we're being realistic about what sustainable measures may assist at particular places, but it is generally a worst case scenario that we think and we hope, in terms of that modal shift and cultural change that I've mentioned in previous sessions, will come about over time with the growth of local communities and with the changes in technology and all those elements that mean that things will change and things are already changing that we can see around us, will have a long-term impact. But clearly we need to monitor that to be sure that that is what's happening, and with the help of our Highways Authority colleagues, think through the way in which we can encourage that type of shift. And indeed, sometimes that type of shift are through a number of different measures, thinking about whether they are more carrot-related measures in terms of the things that can be offered, or stick things that sometimes are just, as we've already said, the nature of a junction being at capacity, people just not using that junction, for instance, or whether there are other measures that have been mentioned, for instance, in terms of some of the emergency funding from government as a result of COVID that is funding at the moment a project to look at improved cycle links, walking cycle links in between Shenfield and Brentwood in particular, that Mr. Fletcher mentioned correctly, that we are fortunate in terms of that money now being available to fund that. And I think some of the comments that are being made, for instance, about cycling reflect the fact that Brentwood has seen limited growth when it comes to larger sites in the last 10 to 15 years, that have therefore meant that we've had limited investment in things such as cycling infrastructure. We believe that the local plan, with the sites that are being promoted here to meet local growth needs, provide an opportunity to invest in the sites specifically that are set out in terms of the cycle improvements and cycle provision that is required on site as part of development, as well as interlinking those opportunities that are set out within the cycle action plan and continued work with colleagues and partners to implement some of that. So we would hope that there would be improvement as a result of local plan growth in future years when compared to more recent years, and the way in which indeed, the conversation about the use of SIL, whenever that comes in terms of our projections moving forward to work on that, Section 106 also allows us to think about that more locally as well, in terms of what we've put in the infrastructure delivery plan for cycling provision. I think that broadly covers the key points that I kind of picked up on that were being mentioned earlier. I don't know whether we want to go into with Stantec colleagues the kind of limitations on growth and the way in which junctions have been assessed. I suspect we may come to that. Sorry.
I would rather do that when we come to looking at the totality of highways assessment and highways mitigation, etc. So if there are specific, because it's whether there are connotations from what may be discussed and whether that has any implications on any junctions, etc., whether it's at the local level or at the more strategic level. So I'd rather not discuss that now. I know you've got your experts in the room, but I'd rather leave that in case there are implications.
Can I just to finish then, just to say that with County Council colleagues, as we've been working over the past few months to think through what the implications of growth are with the revised work that has been done for the transport assessment, just to say that a Wilson's Corner task group has been set up with county colleagues on the back of that work to looking at improved cycling, walking provision between Brentwood and Shenfield, to think about that junction because of the complexities that we face that Mr. Minot and others have correctly stated. Wilson's Corner is a very difficult junction to solve, and so the thought process around that, rather than thinking about the physical mitigation that can be implemented directly there, which is clearly very limited, the wider aspects of cultural change, modal shift, those things, what do they mean on the junction, and how do they impact the wider junctions as a result of that has been discussed. So that is work that we're committed to thinking through with County Council colleagues, being the local highways authority.
Thank you. I've got two hands up. I'm proposing to come to Ms Webster, then Mr Fletcher, then I will go to the council for any response on that, and then I'm going to have a break. So Ms Webster, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a comment with regard to the policies for developers, to be clear to developers, to have elements of their design to incorporate sustainable travel. And I think that's very good for the bigger developments such as West Hildon and Dunton Village. But I'm less clear that that on its own within a development site is so relevant for small developments that might be within the town. If I look at my own area that's likely to be developed, it's very possible to have a cycle route adopted within the small development of Priest Lane, but without it linking to a more borough-wide network that's safe and reliable for travel, is a bit meaningless and a bit pointless. So you can tick the box and say you've done it, but it doesn't really generate sustainable travel, because what you want is you want people to be able to make that trip across the town and not just within a small area.
Thank you. Sorry, Ms Webster, have you finished? Yeah, okay, thank you. Mr Fletcher, please.
Ms Webster's actually pretty much said exactly what I was going to say. The comments about on-site changes are great. We need cycle racks, etc. But it's not on-site that's the issue. It's extending beyond the site into the town centre, for example. So policy needs to really clearly state that. It's not the responsibility of the developer does not end at their site boundary or across the adjacent road. It has to extend further. Thank you.
Council response? Anything further Council wants to add?
I would provide response to that, Inspector. In terms of the cycle infrastructure, the IDP have costed and identified the cycling infrastructure in the Part B, and that was also identified that it will be funded by SIL. Now, in terms of how it connects to site, in F9A, we have proposed amendments to site policies to provide that reference to the cycle infrastructure identified in the cycling action plan. So when development comes forward and provide the cycle infrastructure or cycle routes, it would need to be connected to the routes that were identified in that plan. So that when cycling infrastructure comes forward, it will be coordinated in a holistic manner.
So if, does the council have a plan B in case SIL doesn't come forward as to how this would be delivered?
If development doesn't come, if development...
No, as in if SIL doesn't happen.
Yeah, so if SIL doesn't come forward, when development comes forward, then we would consider a general Section 106 contribution as far as that contribution is compliant with SIL Regulation 122, and which is necessary and relevant to the development. And in the viability assessment, we also include that allowance for the general Section 106 for this scenario.
Thank you. Can I suggest, please, we have a 20-minute break. When we come back, so until 25:02. When we come back, I'd like to talk about the West Horndon multimodal interchange, bit of a mouthful, but that one, and then have a look at the some of the wording of some of the policies. So, so if everybody can be back at 11:55, please. Thank you. multimodal interchange hub that's proposed there. But can I just before we do move on to that, can I just ask if anybody's got any further questions in relation to the sustainable transport measures that we've discussed? Any particular questions on cycleways or walkability or the park and ride, for instance, that sort of thing? Miss Webster, please.
Thank you. I'm not sure how much detail you expect to look at in these proposals, but when I was looking at them, I think Phil Minor probably had the same experience, which was there were some very good suggestions in there, but also quite a lot of the suggestions really aren't viable. And so I think as the evidence base for the sustainable transport, they're a bit weak. And I'm not sure you want to address him right down to the detail of which ones don't work, but to my mind, the evidence council has produced seems to be very optimistic and not based on really good sound evidence that they've got a proper policy in place.
Is this, Ms Webster, is this based on particular measures where you see that the evidence is weak, or is it on, you know, or are you talking the whole plan element of weak?
Specific measures within the, so when there is obviously the headline idea of having certain cycleways, etc., which are in the policy, and then in the backup documents there are specific measures that make up those proposed tangible proposals that they expect to do to meet those. But some of those proposals I don't think are credible. They don't make sense. They just don't work. And therefore, to have included those as a backup to say that you've got these ideas that are going to drive the change of sustainable transport, it seems that the whole thing is built a little bit on a foundations of sand, because the underlying in the proposals don't really support the aspiration.
So are there, can you give me an example of a particular measure where you feel this is weak because?
Yes. So for example, on my road, I've only looked at the town centre really because that's an area I'm interested in. But in my road in particular, there is a proposal. Well, one, I'm on an existing cycle network, which was a news to me. That's going to be modified to be made into a more formal one. And because of the amount of traffic involved, it will need a separate cycleway because of the traffic volumes and speed, but the road can't support an extra cycle lane, so it doesn't work because you can't actually put one in there.
So what you're saying is the aspiration is there, but the evidence behind the deliverability is not there. Is that what you're saying? And that's for a number of measures.
Yes, that mine is only one. I'm not the only one. There are other measures where the deliverability would fail. Similarly, I think the same is true of the park and stride and the school clear zone. There's absolutely no evidence that such a scheme is deliverable. Mr. Minot has already spoken at length about the school clear zone, and he's correct. There is no evidence that it is achievable, and no other county I could find has ever tried such an ambitious scheme to basically turn your entire town centre into a school clear zone and no stopping zone and a 20-mile-an-hour. And we know, Mr. Minot knows from a councillor that I don't think the council would even vote for it, to be honest. I'd be amazed. But it falls down because we have town centre car parks. You can drive into the town centre and park in the car park. Why would you park out of the town to drop off your children in town when you can drop them off for free inside the town and avoid all the problems? So it doesn't really, I don't see how it's supportable. And also one of the main drivers of is a school which has its own car park. So parents drop in from the car park and the council has no ability to influence that behaviour. And being a resident who lives nearby that school, I'd be very surprised if he could influence those particular parents' behaviour, because the council and the school has a great deal of difficulty in doing that. So that's my concern, that actually the underlying deliverability of a lot of those schemes is not there.
Thank you, Ms Webster. Can I ask for a council response on that?
Thank you, Inspector. I need to check on the proposals on Priest Lane. I don't believe anyone's proposing a separate cycleway along Priest Lane. As Ms Webster says, that would be not possible in the sense that there's constraints there. It may be formalising perhaps what is currently informal along the lane, although we appreciate the limitations and the width issues there as exist on other roads, but cyclists can still cycle along there. And so perhaps it's more to do with speed of cars and the relationship between cars and cyclists. But I would need to double check on the line in terms of the specifics of what's being proposed. But broadly, what we're looking at here are schemes specific to sites that have been viability tested, therefore they are viable in our evidence. So I don't believe it's accurate to say that we've not considered it fully in terms of the evidence of what the specific requirements are and what the cost of those requirements are. They're clearly set out in the IDP. There are examples of school clear zones in other areas. Essex County Council, indeed, they may want to add to this, but they're looking at other areas across the county. That is something that is relatively new to Essex, I think, but it's not too new to other areas. Certainly in London, there are areas of school clear zones. There are wider things that are being looked at in other towns across the country about expanding those school clear zones into broader areas of town centres, for instance. But clearly, as I think we're not disagreeing with, there are aspects that have got to be worked through in terms of the wider strategy of how you enable these things to come through. So the points about whether from a political perspective these types of measures would be supported is an important one, and clearly it's a bigger piece of work with the Borough Council as well as the County Council to think about what is achievable, what can be funded, and to join that up. So that they're not just one measure that then, as has been used by the example by Mrs Webster, that you could then be undermined by another thing. For instance, the parking example in the school clear zones. Clearly, there'd need to be a joined-up approach as to how that works, and that's the point really of what we've set out, is that there would need to be work to consider how that would work and how that can benefit the town centre more broadly. But I think coming back to the points that we made earlier, we're not overestimating the impact of those things according to what the impact would be on traffic. We're looking at a worst case scenario that does not consider each and every one of those things to solve huge problems, but to assist in some ways and could assist in further ways should they be all rolled out or indeed all successful.
Mr Robinson, please. Thank you, Mr Drain.
Yeah, thank you, Inspector. Just to clarify the point from Mr Drain, Essex County Council is looking at a number of school streets across the county through the Emergency Active Travel Fund, and we do have some funding in Brentwood. As I say, that's looking at the streets that schools are on as opposed to a zonal approach. And a school street would be a range of measures, and it will depend on local circumstances.
Thank you. Are there any other comments that anybody wants to make on the elements that we've discussed so far? Can I move on to the West Horndon multimodal interchange that is proposed? So still under sustainable transport measures, obviously. Now, this is set out in the transport assessment and is also set out in plan form under Appendix C. And I just wanted to understand, because the transport assessment recognises that provision of sustainable transport measures or provision of sustainable transport existing wise is very poor, or is poor in the southern part of the borough at the moment. That's recognised, and it's recognised that obviously there would be impact of the proposed development, residential as well as employment, and that the measures that are set out, it seems to imply that the measures on the West Horndon public transport interchange would seek to deliver a minimal traffic impact for those sites on the existing highway infrastructure. And then on the F65 Appendix C, which actually looks in map form as to what the measures are or would look like, the commentary there says that the measures will basically negate, will deliver a neutral traffic impact for the sites on the existing highway infrastructure and the specific roads that are set. So again, there could be implications for what's being discussed with Highways England. I recognise that, as to particularly if there are going to be discussions around some of this particular highway infrastructure. So obviously there may be some potential changes, but obviously we don't know yet until those discussions have occurred. But what I want to just understand is what is proposed to be delivered. It's the phasing of that. It's linked in to I think the IDP sets it out that the West Horndon interchange would be funded by its 5 sites, which are in the locality. Excuse me. So I'm trying to understand the sustainable transport measures, and this is a critical project. How is this, or is this clearly set out against each of those allocations as to that this is a critical piece of infrastructure that needs to be provided, or contributions towards that infrastructure need to be provided? So is that clearly set out within policies E10, E11, E12, R01 and R02? So that's one point. But it's how I'd like to understand how these measures will bring about this neutral traffic impact, or limited. The Appendix C says neutral. The actual transport assessment says minimal, which is slightly different. So I just want to have an understanding. So it would be good for the council if you could just start off by just summarising the what the West Horndon multimodal interchange is trying to achieve, and then how it's set out within the actual plan, and whether it's clearly set out within the plan. And then we'll have a look at its phasing in terms of what's going to be delivered when, because we need to understand whether there would be trigger points as to when development could come forward. So can only a certain amount of development come forward before the next phase, before the impact from that development in transport terms is so much that then the next phase of this West Horndon interchange needs to come into play. So I would just like to understand that. So if the council can just give a summary first of all as to what this is trying to achieve, and then we'll come on to more of the detailed points.
Thank you, Inspector. Perhaps if I provide that summary, and then colleagues can help with the detail as we work through the questions that you've got.
Yes, please.
I think we're not clearly, if we've caused confusion, then that's something that we can look to clarify and resolve. I think, put simply, what we're looking to try and achieve at West Horndon is to maximise and make the most of the fact that we've got a public transport interchange there as existing, and with all of the limitations perhaps that I'm sure people in the local area would tell you of, in terms of the fact that the train service there is limited to stopping not as much as it could, in the sense that at the moment, in terms of the points that you've made, it serves a small village, West Horndon, and not a lot else in the Southern Growth Corridor. That being the nature of the strategy that we've looked to employ here through the plan, is to look at both of those growth corridors, and considering the nature of the growth corridor and the South Growth Corridor now is very limited development. So the station serves very limited development, and therefore the roads and connections to that station are limited in comparison to the level of growth that we're proposing. Therefore, the level of growth that we're proposing needs to contribute and invest in the connections to that station. So that's in its most simple terms what we're trying to do here. Obviously, what that then means is this is a number of pieces of work that start with C2C running that train service in terms of expanding their offer, if I put it in simplistic terms of that, in terms of how how often the train stops, how long the train is, in terms of being able to accommodate the amount of people, the demand essentially that will be there in the longer term over time as development is built out, both predominantly through residential development at West Horndon Industrial Estate and of course Dunton Hills Garden Village. The importance of connecting Dunton Hills Garden Village to the station is, I think, stated through policy and the ambitions and indeed the sessions that we'll come on to as well, specific to Dunton Hills. So the station road itself, the requirements of upgrading Station Road to provide that direct physical link between the station and the Garden Village is important. And indeed the extent to which that people would have a choice to drive in their car, for instance, to the station. So what we've been looking at with the designs of the station is to limit growth in parking facilities, so that essentially what is achieved there is to maintain the level of car parking that is currently there, on the basis that Network Rail C2C will want to maintain that as a minimum, but not grow it, so that we are essentially encouraging people to come and drive and park at West Horndon Station. And if the links along Station Road are as we feel they should be, encouraging walking, cycling and bus routes going up and down that, then what we're trying to do clearly in terms of the junction arrangements as well, prioritising the most direct route for public transport and walking and cycling, hopefully means that people will choose to not drive, essentially. And then, of course, there's the kind of details of what that looks like, as you've mentioned, is set out within the evidence to show some indicative drawings at this point of what we've come up with to show how we would be able to achieve that on site, and that's been discussed with C2C and Network Rail in terms of that kind of bus interchange, the way in which vehicles and people access the station, and the limitations, I suppose, again, just physically that you have there with the junction arrangement and buildings that surround it, working within that to achieve something that works. That's something that we have drawn up. And then broadly, clearly trying to ensure that in the longer term, i.e. by the end of the plan period, when you have a train service that is able to meet demand in that area and is able to function with the surrounding highway network, it can then be linked properly to our residential developments nearby, as well as our employment sites in terms of those 5 that you've listed. So that would be East Horndon Hall, Brentwood Enterprise Park and Childerditch Industrial Estate, I believe, would be that would make up the 5 sites effectively. That is the 5 major development sites, or the 5 allocations as proposed in the plan within the corridor, that would then need to contribute to West Horndon as being that central point at which we're able to get public transport linked to London and the rest of South Essex. So that, I hope, provides an overall summary, and obviously we can get into the details of the policies as they refer to that requirement site by site, as well as the phasing of what is required and when.
Can I just ask, in terms of the C2C, is there capacity within the timetable to make improvements to the number of I know sometimes with timetabling it's so acute that, you know, it's literally an additional 30 seconds is only available on the timetabling, etc., depending upon the route and that. So is there having had those discussions with C2C, there is room for either increased services or increased length of time at passenger stations, because you've got longer carriages or whatever it takes, because it depends on how many seconds or minutes is required for each stop. Is there capacity there in the timetabling?
What we've established with C2C is that there's a physical capacity for longer trains, for instance, so minimal work required physically. But of course, as you've said, what that then requires are timetable amendments to accommodate that extra stop. And as you said, the time that it takes to stop. Of course, C2C are looking at that at West Horndon as well as other growth along the line as well. So I think Mr. Ubaka no doubt will be able to assist. We have an awareness of the fact that C2C know that this growth is coming. They know that they need to plan for it, and they have within their programme an idea of the timetable amendments that would need to be made in order to accommodate it.
So they haven't come back to you and said, oh no, this just isn't feasible because we can't fit it within the timetable. I've got Mr. Ubaka shaking his head, so let's hear from Mr. Ubaka on that one, please.
Thank you, Inspector. C2C have been very clear, and in my career I've done one or two rail networks, particularly within London. The dwell time issue isn't serious at this point, and would allow significant growth in the area to occur with just increased lengths of trains at this point, i.e. going from a 4-car to an 8-car. The length of tracks at West Horndon are enviable. Having done lots of stuff in London, I'd have loved platforms this length and some of the stations we had, and then had to thereby extend to put more capacity through them. So the dwell times that you're mentioning in terms of this actual train stopping can be accommodated within the current timetable, because the current timetable in terms of reporting back to ORR needs to accommodate force majeure, as it were, i.e. something goes wrong and they can still run the existing timetable that they've got. All we're basically doing is significantly increasing capacity to allow the existing timetable to soak up more people as the various developments came forward.
Thank you. And just sticking with C2C at the moment, are the trains going in the directions where people will wish to travel?
Yes, they are. Interestingly enough, one of the busiest interchanges, people talk about going into Fenchurch Street, but the busiest interchange is actually West Ham. And because this goes through West Ham, people have an opportunity to get off there. That then brings them onto things like the Jubilee line, etc., that gets them all over London. So it is a very, very popular route. Having worked in Southend, the C2C route compared to the one that comes out of Victoria that goes into Liverpool Street is much preferred in Southend. So it is a very busy route, and I'm sure the locals will testify to that. AM peak, currently with the lengths of the trains, you'll be pressed to get a seat, because it is a very popular route down track, and therefore as more development comes on, there will be a need, and C2C recognise this, to expand the length of their trains.
Thank you. I noticed that Mr. Phone, Councillor Phone, your hand is up, so I'll bring Councillor Phone in now, and then we'll continue then. So Councillor Phone?
Yeah, I mean, the statement that the line is very busy is true pre-COVID, and I suspect that once COVID evaporates in some shape or form, that will remain. I can confirm that there is most rush hour trains are 8 carriages. In fact, I think they're all 8 carriages, but it's easy to extrapolate those up to 12. And actually the platform, if you did a bit of maintenance work on it, you could put 16 carriage trains into West Horndon Station without any difficulty. That is not a particular issue as far as West Horndon is concerned and the line. The one thing you have to recognise is that unlike the line going through the centre of Brentwood, we have only 2 tracks each way, and it would not be possible to extrapolate that to widen it. You perhaps could do it east of West Horndon, but west of West Horndon you go into Greater London and there is absolutely no room, no capacity to put extra tracks in. So we are limited to two-track trains, and we are also limited at Fenchurch Street, which is of course the junction terminus, to the fact they've only got 4 platforms up there, and they turn trains round in the rush hour in about 6 minutes. So the ability to increase capacity in terms of number of trains is more or less zero, but in terms of having an actual extra bit of time to stop at West Horndon or come to any of the other stations, because of the logistics of the way trains come in from Southend, some coming in via Tilbury, etc., you would be able to put an extra minute or couple of minutes on certain stations where the trains don't stop. Now, without any real difficulty, it wouldn't be a problem from the logistics perspective as far as that is concerned. I have other major issues, but we'll come to those when you address them a bit later.
Thank you. Thank you. Right, nobody else wants to talk at the moment. Okay, so thank you for that. That's been really useful. Can I... Now, you're saying that this is what's in front of us in terms of the transport assessment is indicative at this stage. Is that correct for West Horndon?
The plans as drawn up, yes. They are an indication of what could be achieved. Clearly, we would want to have C2C and Network Rail agree that or essentially set out what it is that they would require. But what I would say is that those drawings have been drawn with C2C and Network Rail the whole way through regular meetings that we have with C2C. They're indeed basing their discussions with Network Rail about what's required at the station on our drawings. So Mr. Ibaka's been involved in that and drawn those, and is involved with C2C on making sure that whatever they require is considered as part of the drawings, and then C2C are using those drawings to inform Network Rail of what they will need to be doing.
Right. So it's a good, at the moment, it's a good indication, and it's going in that those discussions are happening. And okay, just to understand that. Now, on the plan, you show the walking and cycling distances, sort of in 10. It's the as the crow flies, sort of normal aspects. So looking at where the existing developments, the proposed development, well, some of them are existing, but where some of the existing employment sites are, etc., and where some of the other proposed developments are along that southern corridor, you've got a 10-minute walking zone that's set out. It would be useful to understand actually how long it would take to walk from these areas. So you've got a 10-minute zone, but that's not telling me actually how long it would take to walk from the centre of sites. I know it's based on centre of sites, so it'll be even further from those on the edge of further away from the sites. It would be useful to have a 20-minute and a 30-minute zones, etc. And it could be, well, for instance, Enterprise Business Park, it would be considerably more, wouldn't it? So in terms of realism of walkability to the Enterprise Park from this hub, that's not really realistic unless you put your hiking boots on and off you go. Is it realistic from Childerditch, for instance? Is it realistic in terms of, I'm talking purely walking at this stage, not the cycling, but in terms of that realism that's put in? I mean, obviously it's fact. If that's how long it takes to get there, that is fact, isn't it? But it's that realism of the achievability of what's proposed from a walking perspective. Is that achievable, or do you feel it's more going to be pushing towards cycling because that reduces the amount of time quite significantly?
Yes, clearly Brentwood Enterprise Park and Childerditch Industrial Estate are the furthest away in terms of the proposed allocations from the station, and it would be a long walk, and it would also be a long walk alongside the A127, which is possible, and indeed the cycling route would no doubt take that route as well. But we're mindful of the fact that it may not, at the current standards, be the most attractive place to sort of walk alongside, although very direct, linking there with the station and the other roads that would come down to it. But I think effectively, I mean, we could set out what those walking times would be. I don't think that would be a regular decision that you'd make to walk between those areas unless you, as you said, enjoy a hike. So that is why we've looked at as well the sort of public transport elements as well as cycling that could be affected and brought in to link the station.
Because I was just going to move on to the public transport side of it. And I know we'll talk about Dunton Hills this afternoon, so we may well be using this again, but talking from a Dunton Hills perspective, I don't particularly want to linger on that now. In relation to what's proposed, I mean, Childerditch is quite a small industrial estate. It's very much on its own. So how would public transport be used in that way? Because it's directly off the main carriageway, dual carriageway. So how would public transport be utilised in that sense? I'm just trying to think of how it would work and how it would, any additional development linked with Childerditch, for instance, would be utilising this sort of hub, interchange hub.
I'll let Mr. Obaka come in. I suspect we're thinking along the same lines, which is that we've thought about the way in which demand responsive transport could be the model to achieve that, rather than necessarily just your standard timetabled bus service, which would be much more limited, running up and down the O127 and serving Childerditch Industrial Estate, for instance. But we have looked at with providers of demand responsive transport schemes in other areas who have interest in this area, the way in which you could think, and I recall we touched on this subject in previous sessions, but you can consider the way in which surrounding areas, indeed Upminster to the west, Basildon to the east, for instance, and the Dunton Ford Works, the level of demand that there could be from people who want to get to and from those places to work and to where they live along the corridor, and the way in which West Horner Station relates to that has been the main focus of how those particular industrial estates can relate to the station.
Thank you. Mr. Obaka, is there anything you want to add in relation to this demand response? I think Mr. Drain's probably taken your thunder there.
No, Inspector, no, he hasn't taken my thunder. It just shows how closely we've been working over the years. His answer was perfection itself.
Okay, right. Well, obviously we'll have a look at that. Can I just have an understanding about the phasing? So it was the point I raised earlier about if this is a critical piece of infrastructure. You clearly set that out in the IDP. It's absolutely critical to bring forward this development as part of other critical infrastructure to ensure that to bring forward the planned growth that's set out in the plan. So in the transport assessment is clearly set out as a phased approach. So how would that fit with how much development could come forward before the next phase, before the first phase occurs, before the next phase occurs, etc.? How does that impact on the council's aspirations of ensuring that there is minimal impact from the development in transport terms? So if you could just try and set that out so that we can understand that in a little bit more detail, that'd be very helpful, please.
Phil, do you want me to pick that up, or would you like to do it?
Perhaps, yes. Thanks, David.
Okay, in very simple terms then, as we've already outlined, and Councillor Fone has sort of agreed to this, and the first stages would be physically increasing the size of the trains themselves. There is a realistic time scale it takes to change bus routes. Bus routes are defined by the public sector. Sorry, the private sector. They're run by the private sector. The 1 or 2 bus routes that come in and out of here. So moving those and encouraging them to come into an interchange to start their routes, as well as allowing DRT services to utilise the same stops in the future, will take time, and therefore there is no impact on development starting from acceptance of the plan, really passing of the plan. They can get going, and quite a significant capacity of development over the years can be soaked up by physically increasing the size of the trains. There will come a cut-off point around 50% whereby you might need to, and C2C are already looking at this, as Councillor Fone quite rightly pointed out, is a 2-track system. The current it fails in current standards in that it doesn't allow for a disabled access to both sides of the track, and therefore one of the early phases that will be impingent upon C2C as the train operating company, or the TOC, will be to put such an element in to replace the very old rickety metal bridge that goes over the tracks that I'm always terrified to use when I use the station. So a new facility like that would go in, but again, that would have no impact on sort of the physicality of the place itself. It'll just be an upgrade on an existing train crossing that was there. So you'd have that be the first stages for me. It would be the increase in trains, and then the disabled access would go in. Towards the end of the plan, as Dunton was more fully delivered and West Horndon was more fully delivered, you would have to start to look at improving things like access through gate lines, because the more people that are trying to use this, particularly in the peak we're talking about now, and we are fairly convinced, given COVID and given changes in working pattern, that actually a lot of movement in the future is going to be off these peak shoulders. But C2C might be requiring to increase the size of the gate lines. There is space in the existing alignment to change things around and increase the gate lines sufficiently without having to knock things down at the moment. So they could do that as a phase 1B if they wanted to, and allow more capacity. But eventually, towards the end of the plan, and I think this is why we started these conversations with C2C, they recognise, not only for us, but also for the potential future plans of stuff the other side of the track in Thurrock, they will need a more regional type interchange to deal with not just the growth that's within Brentwood, but the growth that is going to come through regionally. And that will require at some point a brand new station that has bigger capacity, because one of the things that train stations need to do is they need to allow sufficient space between each passenger so you're not all clumped together trying to get through gate lines. And that is the restriction. At the moment, we don't have the problem, and for the majority of Dunton coming forward, the problem really doesn't exist as long as we can get more train throughput. The other question you asked with regards to physical changes to the timetable, I'll just address that. Longer trains will only take so much, and this is up to C2C to come back to us and confirm. We have been in conversation with them, and again, Councillor Fone was absolutely right. There are restrictions at Fenchurch Street, but actually the key pinch point again is West Ham. Now it's up to the timetable gymnastics of my colleagues at Network Rail to decide how many trains need to go all the way to Fenchurch Street and how many can be turned around and basically put back the other way to service back to Southend from West Ham, for example, using that 2-track system. And it's something that, as an ex-railway planner, is done all the time. As I say, that is the basic triggers. I think that the full station is probably going to be triggered by a full-sized and fully operational Southern Growth Corridor. And those are the conversations we're currently having with C2C and Network Rail.
Thank you. I've got a few hands up, so I'm going to go to Councillor Fone first, and then I'll come to Mr. Robinson.
Thank you. That assessment is broadly correct. The big problem with West Horndon is the access to the station. Now, we're talking about the junction on the A128 into the site, and I'm no expert about that, but I'm assuming that experts would be able to deliver one of those. Based upon recent discussions with Brentwood Council last week, there appear to be plans that make access into the station more acceptable than it is at the minute, although I do have to say that I am very sceptical about it. But nevertheless, let's accept that that could be done safely. But there is another absolutely critical, crucial point that I can't see how you can deliver. And that is the fact that the road going through the village has a very narrow pinch point at the junction of Thornton Avenue and Lombard's Chase. The pavement there, you can't get two people to walk past each other. It's so narrow. And how you're going to get cyclists and things past there, I really don't know. We have accidents on the pedestrian crossing. Fortunately, nobody has been seriously injured. But because lorries park to go and get a packet of cigarettes in the local corner shop, and Essex Highways are not interested in trying to prohibit that. We've had discussions with them over the years, and they just go, well, we can't do anything about it. This is a place where, yes, you could get cyclists to sustainably go through the village, but you're not going to get zero traffic, because if the redevelopment of the industrial estate takes place, then there will be lots of cars coming through, and I just see it as I can't see how you could do it and do it safely, not using going through West Horndon Village. It's just, I just can't see how it can be done. And I've not seen any suggestions in any of the documentation that I have seen that I have any confidence in how it could be done. And I'm going back to the same sort of points and strategy that Mr. Minot was talking about earlier. There's lots of wonderful words and say how lovely it'll be, but I just cannot see how it can be done practically. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Phone. If I bring in Mr. Robinson, please.
Thank you, Inspector. I'm just going to clarify in terms of the phasing itself. Essex County Council would seek the links to key destinations such as the station would be prior to first occupation, but there'd be some form of sustainable transport linkage before anybody moves in. Obviously, if at planning application stage, discussions could take place about any alternative threshold, but the default position is before anybody moves in.
And in terms of those sustainable transport links, that's the nothing specific, but you would be looking at, or would you be requiring the cycle routes to be in, the bus routes to be available, etc.?
Yeah, so the provision for walking and cycling or public transport in whichever form, whichever is deemed to be appropriate.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Council, do you want to respond to the points that Councillor Phone has made, please? And anything further on Mr. Robinson's point, but I think he was just trying to assist there.
Yeah, thank you, Inspector. In terms of Councillor Phone's comments, clearly we understand the issues that exist at the moment. Indeed, the reference to HGVs potentially causing situations whereby safety is a concern is, of course, one of the reasons why we're looking at redevelopment of the industrial estate to provide for uses that we believe, and I think is broadly supported by residents, would be more consistent with what the village would like to see, and creating that sort of opportunity for a village centre along with the station improvements that come with that. We would hope that thereby we would be completely reducing HGV movement through the village, and indeed, obviously, then you still have vehicle movement. So I don't think we're saying that we would completely remove vehicle movement coming through the village. That is going to be a natural part of where growth is and where people are travelling to get to places like the station, for instance. But of course, what we do have to think about, as County Council colleagues have helped us with and are reflected in the drawings that we have, are the ways in which we can, for instance, reduce speed limits, reduce the particular safety concerns that there may be in terms of that interaction between cyclists, walkers, and vehicles as they move through the village. And of course, there are points, as Councillor Fone has set out, where existing road widths limit what you might like to do, for instance, by having a separate cycleway, if that were appropriate, and a wide path and a roadway, and that would be ideal. And clearly, the opportunity to design that type of thing in Dunton Hills Garden Village is there, but where you're working with existing villages, there are particular constraints and restrictions. But what we've drawn, we think, is accurate according to the way in which you can share cycle, vehicle, sort of roadway, as it were. What I've just mentioned there about reducing speed limits may aid that sort of interaction between those two uses, as well as providing a pathway as is there at the moment, and hopefully improving that to make it as attractive as possible for people to use. So I think we understand the limitations that there are when you're working with existing situations that are potentially less than satisfactory for local residents. But everything that we've set out within evidence, I believe, and I think we have the support of highways authorities and indeed C2C as we're looking to achieve the aspirations that we've set out here, show a way in which we can do that. And that's what we're trying to do at this stage, display how we can achieve the aspirations that we have. And clearly applications will come forward, and there will be further discussion, as Mr. Robinson has set out, in exactly how that's delivered and when.
Thank you, Mr. Drain. Can I just, I think it's slightly different on this point, talking about particular sites, but if I can just pick on West Horndon Industrial Estate, so policy RO2, the wording that's set out in there, obviously I'm looking at the submitted plan. I'm just trying to understand how this is going to be, the interchange is to be funded and therefore delivered, and whether it's clearly set out in the policy. So I'm just picking West Horndon Industrial Estate just as one example.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, Mark.
No, sorry, go on.
If we go to B11 first of all, which is a generic policy. Just bear with me, I'm just scrolling up.
Is it B11 submitted? Or
B11 in F9A. F9A.
Yeah.
Sorry, just bear with me. If one goes to criterion B, so just to read the policy, so those who don't have it in front of them know what we're talking about. In order to support and address the cumulative impacts of planned growth, allocated development within the local plan will provide reasonable and proportionate contribution to increase capacity and required mitigation measures to transport infrastructure in the borough, including, and then B, circulation arrangements and public realm around West Horndon Station, and the creation of associated multimodal interchange through phases to support new residents and employees. So that's the requirement. And one would anticipate from that that the actual phasing of payments or the phasing of works, I should say, would take place once it's agreed at development management stage.
I suppose looking at what I'm trying to understand is how that can be delivered through a section 106.
This policy,
because the policy BE11, yes, it applies to well, you can argue it applies to all development, but then the IDP makes it clear that the delivery of the interchange hub would only be for 5 allocations.
That's right, yes. And
so should it just be relevant to those 5 allocations if that's justified? And if so, should it be absolutely made clear? Because at the moment, the policy doesn't say that for West Horndon, so RO2, etc.
No, it doesn't. There are 3 ways of dealing with that: either leaving it as it is and bringing forward the 122 test at the time to show that there is a relationship, a reasonable relationship between the requirement and the proposed development. Secondly, is to take it out of here and put it into the individual site allocations, which is another approach. Sorry, there are only 2. Those are the 2 options. So either way, I suggest one could be satisfied that in this form or transferred into the other site-specific policies, the requirement would be enforceable.
Let me bring in my colleague, Mr. Warden, please.
Thank you, Mrs. Wright. I have a question about the physical access, but I'll just pick up a point in relation to this current discussion, and just ask whether if planning permission is given for West Horndon after SIL is introduced, and for sites given planning permission after SIL was introduced, if SIL is introduced a year after the adoption of the plan, then how would the requirement in section 106 relate to the requirements of SIL to avoid this double dipping term, so that you're not requiring a section 106 that actually is appropriately
it won't be in SIL. It won't be. Yeah. Sorry, so I've just taken some instructions just to make sure. These specific arrangements, requirements, or types of infrastructure will not be included in the SIL list. So these will be specifically dealt with by Section 106 contributions on a site-by-site basis.
Okay. In relation to the access for the interchange, there are in the appendix to the transport assessment a couple of drawings which include a roundabout. And when we discussed the West Horndon site last time, it was recognised that there are some issues about access to resolve. Is that where that discussion is now, in terms of how the access could be best put into place to be able to serve West Horndon development site and the interchange?
Yes, thank you, Inspector. That's broadly correct in terms of trying to solve an existing issue, which local residents will certainly report. And I think, indeed, anecdotally, yourselves as inspectors have seen, when being on site is quite an unsafe situation where the bend is and the way in which vehicles come across there. So the roundabout formation is our suggestion of what we think could resolve those issues, albeit working within certain constraints. And I think that is broadly acceptable. As we discussed with regard specifically to the site, the land ownerships, in terms of making that work ideally, would be to bring land ownerships together in order that you can therefore achieve that without further constraining it, if that makes sense, without looking at a map and looking exactly where those land ownerships then mean that you would need to try and accommodate the roundabout if you were not to go across the 2.
And in terms of progression to resolving those issues, what is the, where are we in terms of that, looking at timescales, for example?
Yeah, as part of the master plan work that's being undertaken by the site promoters there, working together as we've set out within the statement of common ground, that is something that is being worked through. And indeed, what also needs to then be included, as I understand, with pre-application discussion with county council colleagues specifically on the highways points, is to make sure that that's acceptable. As I understand it, that arrangement is accepted as being a solution. It is probably more the finer detail of exactly what that looks like and how traffic flows go around that and fine tuning it, but that is a solution that is accepted.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Thank you, Mrs. Wright. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Fletcher, please.
Yes, thank you. In terms of the councillor's comments about cycling access to the station and the narrow width, has there been consideration accessing the station from the south side of the railway line using the underpass and then modifying the cycle path along the south side of the railway and accessing the station from the south?
Are you happy for me to come back on that?
If you want to respond on that, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, thanks, Mr. Fletcher. We did look at the extent to which you could utilise, for instance, the railway sidings to provide a very direct link, just for example, between Dunton Hills and the station, rather than going along Station Road, and indeed utilising where you've got existing provision, as you say, underpass and bridges there in that area. I think what we've tried to come up with ultimately is to utilise part of the principles of the growth corridor work that we undertook was to utilise existing highway land wherever possible, because of the difficulties in obtaining sort of rights access and indeed the ability to implement that type of thing along network rail land, which becomes complicated. So that's not as to sort of rule that out. If that were to be something that could come forward in the future, I'm sure that would be of great benefit. And indeed, in terms of what you're referring to the south of the line, may well be informed by whatever Thurrock Council consider as appropriate through their local plan process when they're considering this broader area, as we've identified through other sessions. That is an area that they are considering as an option, and they've been keen, I think, to stress that it is just an option at the moment rather than a preference. But once they come to that decision and the way in which we will be engaging with them through their local plan process and how it affects West Horndon as an existing community, will, I'm sure, be part of what wider benefits there could be from that type of link, for instance. So I just make mention of this in terms of the memorandum of understanding work that we're undertaking with C2C and Network Rail and other partners, is to consider almost, I think we referred to this a while back when we had the session on the broader strategic issues, the way in which proposals as we've proposed them can be a sort of potentially a phase one approach in terms of Brentwood growth and the way in which that would work around Brentwood Station, but that would not stop, for instance, Thurrock growth coming forward, and thereby meaning that you could achieve wider improvements to accommodate that at the station. So my reason for referring to that really would be to say I think cycling infrastructure could also be considered as part of that, clearly, if there were to be wider growth that would therefore enable those types of links. But at present, in terms of what we're looking at, the level of growth and the practicalities of delivering improvements to the way in which people travel, we've focused on the existing highway land because we think that's the most viable and achievable way of doing it.
Thank you. Is there anything further on that anybody wishes to discuss on the West Horndon interchange hub? Councillor Phone, was there anything else that you wanted to, you referred to earlier that there were other points you wanted to raise? Have those all been discussed?
I have discussed those. My real concern is that if you have the hub there, which I have no problem with per se, I think it's a good idea. The problem is that the link goes through West Horndon Village, and I just think that given that the road isn't straight, given all the obstructions and other bits and pieces on there, I worry about people's safety. I worry more about cyclist safety than pedestrians. I think pedestrians probably would be reasonably safe, but the number of nearby incidents that I see taking place going through the village with cyclists is scary. I'm sorry. I really worry about it, and I hope that the highways people will be able to address it. I can't think of a way of doing it personally, and that is my concern. People's safety. It's all very well to be healthy and having a nice life cycling about, but to get yourself underneath a car and get killed is not safe. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Councillor Fone. Anything further the council wants to add about West Horndon interchange? Because I think we're just going to move on and just look at just finish off looking at some of the policies, and then just a couple of points at the end. So we've got 25 minutes, so we'll certainly be finishing by 1 at the latest. Can we then just have a look at the policy wording? I totally agree that BE11 needs to be rewritten, because as it's written at the moment, it reads as a form of objectives. There are some elements of requirements in there, but so I agree that policy BE11 does need some work doing to it, and setting out the strategic transport requirements in this strategic transport infrastructure policy, which it is a strategic policy. Is this one of the policies that's proposed to be moved within the plan? I'm trying to recall now.
Yes, ma'am.
It is, yeah. Because at the moment, obviously, it's sat under sustainable transport, so which isn't quite relevant. So, or not all quite relevant. So that would make more sense. We will have a think about whether the particulars in relation to, or we would also like the council to have a think about this, if in relation to the West Horndon interchange, we will obviously have this discussion in relation to any particular mitigation on highways terms for particular requirements, but that's a discussion for another session now. Whether those requirements need to be specifically set out within the site allocations, thinking about it logistically as to how it works with section 106, etc., etc. I hear what Mr. Shadoravian is saying in relation to, well, if it's regulation 122 compliant, then obviously it's compliant. But I'm thinking about where it just gives that clarity, particularly where if infrastructure is put into place, so, and then retrospectively contributions are then required from later development. For instance, say the West Horndon site RO2 doesn't come forward for a number of years, for instance, how will that be claimed back? And if it's made perfectly clear in the policy, then that's the hook. So if you can just have a look at that in a little bit more detail, and we will obviously have a think about that ourselves as well, as to whether that needs to be done.
Yes, but, I will. I will do that, Ma'am.
Thank you.
Don't forget, we've also got the contributions policy, where we are looking at making modifications to that to refer to retrospective payments, as we discussed in an earlier session.
Yes, yeah.
So we've got that as well. Just to confirm that the items in B11, other than E, are non-SIL items. So these will all be delivered via Section 106 contributions. E are the types of measures to which we were referring earlier in our discussion about other sustainable transport measures. And that's already dealt with in B16, so that could easily come out, because B16 is going to be beefed up a bit to refer to those particular types.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Thank you. So now in relation to these policies that are taking away BE11, the other policies are more development management policies. You're suggesting in your hearing statement that it's made explicit in the plan that these policies apply to all development within the borough. And that I think this discussion happened before, wasn't it, on some of the site allocation policies, where some of the developers or promoters of the sites were saying actually it would be more useful if all requirements were just set out in one policy. It's not necessarily a soundness issue, because obviously the plan needs to be read as a whole, as we're fully aware. But you want to make it explicit in there that it's not just these policies, there are the requirements that may be additional requirements set out within the site-specific policies. So, as I said, we'll have a look at that. But it does make sense that you make that explicit within the plan, because then it makes it a little bit clearer. Although any developer should be reading the plan as in its entirety anyway, to be fair. So.
Yeah, we want to resolve any potential ambiguity. So
it's just ensuring, and it's ensuring consistency. That's the issue. Is if something's mentioned in one policy, it needs to be absolutely consistent in the other.
Indeed.
Without doing too much repetition. That would be good. Thank you. Any other questions or queries on BE11? Mr. Robinson.
Thank you, Inspector. Just a couple of minor points. Conscious it may be being rewritten slightly anyway, but point D of BE11 should have reference to pedestrian infrastructure as well as cycling and public transport's in there already. And then point D should refer to schools as well as stations in terms of public realm improvements.
Are you okay? So are you looking at the F9A version?
So yes, the F9A.
Okay. So our go-to is always the submitted.
Okay.
So I was just thinking there isn't a D, but now I know. Yes, there is a D. Yes, I think if you can assist the council in coming up with appropriate wording, I'm sure the council will be happy to just because they said they were going to have a look at this. It absolutely needs changing from what's set out in the submitted plan, because that's just listing objectives. So if you can assist the council in any way in coming up with the wording, then I'm sure that would be much appreciated. Thank you. Anything else on policy BE11 for now? No. Now, policy BE12, the council has suggested its deletion. Anybody have any comments they wish to make on policy BE12 or the council's suggestions? No. Okay. We're content with that because it doesn't. It's not an effective policy as it's written. But if we move on to policy BE13, so it's looking at the purpose and soundness of this policy and what it's trying to achieve. So I suppose sort of looking at the framework and what the framework is trying to promote and ensure is provided. Is this policy trying to promote what's set out in the framework in relation to, I think it's paragraph 104 in particular. Although there's other elements within the framework, but it's about providing high quality walking and cycling networks and supporting facilities, because this is particularly around sustainable travel and walkability, isn't it? And yes, again, you are proposing some changes, suggested changes in F9A on this one as well, although it's more about tightening the words up.
It is, Mum. Getting rid of the word you dislike, which is facilitate.
Yes.
I quite understand why. So the wording's been tightened up a little just to make it more effective, essentially.
Does anybody have any questions or queries on BE 13 they want to raise? I suppose again it's just about the maybe tightening up the wording. Criterion B, development proposals should seek to provide. Again, I'm not keen on should seek because that's not a requirement. So are you saying that development proposals must provide, or I'm trying to understand.
Sorry, I can't see the word seek in my.
It's on B. It's on criterion B.
Oh, I see. Yes, I'm sorry. The main B. Yes, of course.
Yes, sorry, main B, not little b. Yes.
No, it should be should provide appropriate provision.
Okay. Again, and.
Although the language, the grammar needs sorting out quite clearly, but should provide the following sustainable measures. So that's just simply a matter of grammar and getting rid of seek to. So it's a requirement to provide appropriate sustainable measures.
And in little a, so it's big B, yes. Little a.
Yeah.
You've got the provision of pedestrian, cycle, public transport, and where appropriate, bridleway connections within development sites and to the wider area. Obviously, you've got the wording in there where appropriate, so that then covers your whether it's would be appropriate under Reg 122.
Yes.
Whether how wide means, doesn't it, in relation to any particular development. So I'm presuming that means off-site rather than on-site delivery.
Yes, it does. It does, Mark. Yes.
Okay, there's probably a bit of tightening up of the supporting text that probably needs to be done. There is some superfluous wording there that's not necessarily helpful, but I'll leave that up to the council to have a look at that.
Very good.
Anything further on BE 13?
Not from us, Mel.
No, nobody else wants to talk. Moving on to BE 14 then, which is sustainable passenger transport. And again, you've set out some suggested changes in the wording in F9A. And I'm trying to understand the purpose of the policy, because you state development proposals, and you're proposing to change the should to are required to, so which obviously gives more effectiveness. To protect and enhance existing passenger transport capacity. I'm trying to understand exactly what that means. And is that really what the plan is trying to achieve, or are you trying to deliver appropriate sustainable transport measures? Because the passenger transport capacity, I'm just trying to get my head around whether that's the appropriate wording and what the plan is trying to deliver. You want to keep what you've already got, is what that seems to be saying.
Yes. So yes, to keep
in terms of capacity, but not necessarily in terms of routes or services, or because that could change.
That could change, and so the idea is that capacity should be protected and enhanced where possible. So that it's plainly an ambition of the plan and its sustainability objectives, that passenger transport should be enhanced. So that is what that's trying to do. It's a generic policy. And so
it's not just to the site allocations, it's to all development.
It's to all development. And again, one could actually take a reference from the Tier 3 sustainable transport objectives, where bus stops and things like that are referred to be placed in developments.
And then C is in reference to pick up and drop off facilities, etc. But there is, again, there's the word should provide. So it's whether it.
Yeah, so it needs consistency and approach and wording.
Yeah,
there, so
yeah. If you can just have a look at that.
Yeah.
Okay. No other queries? Anybody else got any queries on policy BE14? No. Moving on to policy BE15 then, please. And again, Council, you suggest some changes to this policy. And you've got facilitate in there.
It'll come up.
That's okay. We might let it facilitate through. No, we won't. All development proposals should, wherever practicable. So what is this? What is this policy trying? It's trying to encourage, or is it requiring the provision of electric vehicle charge points or spaces, appropriate spaces? Because the framework talks about having appropriate spaces, parking spaces, isn't it? So that electrical vehicle can be charged. And then it also talks about appropriate designs in terms of locations, convenient access, etc., etc. So I'm just trying to understand, without, obviously, we don't want any repetition of what national policy says, but what is this policy trying to achieve? Because there's no requirements actually set out in there.
No, and looking at it now, it's trying to do two things. One of those is to encourage the greater use of electric and low emission vehicles, first and foremost, by designing in capacity within developments to allow them to be parked and have access to charging facilities. So that's what it's trying to do. So one, to increase the capacity of developments for these vehicles, and two, to provide the means of charging them. So I think a simple change to the policy to make it clear that those are the two objectives, and that proposed developments should, where practicable, include those facilities and greater capacity.
Well, if we can leave you with just coming up with the wording on that one, and then
yes,
we'll
it'll be very, very simple.
Look at that. Yeah, that'd be very useful. Thank you for that. And then we have had if we move on to BE16, we have had a discussion around this policy to some extent. And I note the changes that are suggested in F9A, which again is to tighten up the wording rather than change anything of significance within the actual policy itself.
Yeah, just to tighten it up again and make it effective.
Yeah, I think if you can have a look at that again and just make sure that it's being very specific, and if you can ensure that your supporting text justifies what's set out in the policy. So I'm just looking at the BA just for a minute. That's okay. Right. Any queries or questions from anybody on anything further on that? No. I think if we just have a look at that one again, just to make sure.
Yeah, of course.
That's fine. And we move on to the final policy in this suite, is the parking standards policy. Now you've got the policy that's set out in your submitted plan, and then you've got your suggested changes. I think you know what I'm going to say, or potentially what I'm going to say. The policy requires parking standards to be met that aren't set out in the plan. If parking standards are to be set, they need to be set out in the plan, which they're not, and they haven't been consulted on as part of any policy that's being set. So in this, as such, they're a very important material consideration, absolutely, because they would be adopted standards by the county council, but they're not absolute policy requirements. So it's more of a consideration needs to be, or regard needs to be given to these, whatever the wording is that you think is appropriate. But to need compliance with something that's not in the plan is not appropriate. So, but obviously in determining planning applications, these standards can be a very important material consideration and it can be given appropriate weight in dealing with planning applications. So
what we can do, I mean, they're not our parking standards. They can't.
No, we know that. They're Essex County Council. I know. I understand.
So we could take out the requirement for compliance and say that parking will be assessed in accordance with the county council's parking standards for the time being, or from time to time. So that will take away the policy requirement for strict compliance, but make it a material consideration.
Okay. I will bring in Mr. Robinson, and then I'll bring in Mr. Minot on this. Mr. Robinson, please.
Just a point of clarity, the standards being referenced are the standards of the Essex Planning Officers Association, of which Essex County Council are a signatory, as are Brentwood Borough Council. So they're not Essex County Council standards per se.
Yes, thank you for the clarification. Yes, I was aware of that. You do make that clear. Yeah. Thank you. Mr. Minot.
Yes, I've actually, apologies if things are getting complicated here. I've run into some problems in the last day or so with finding it difficult to access the latest versions of some of these things, because there's been issues with the council website from the point of view of my machines. I was actually going to make a point about BE16, but I might just come back to that in a moment. Just in terms of BE17, my view has always been that the council would it would be far preferable if the council was to go through a process of coming up with its own parking standards. I appreciate that that's not actually a statutory or a necessary part of the local plan process. I would like this to be something which is as locked in as possible. And obviously, as you're saying, given that the parking standards have not been consulted on because they're not part of the local plan, the wording changes which are being talked about, I understand. I mean, I understand why you're saying that that's the way it needs to be phrased. Just really to express my point of view, that I would like it to go the other way in terms of the parking standards being something which Brentwood has gone through a process on, has consulted on, is talking about in the local plan, and can then ask for a compliance. Obviously, we're not in that situation, and so that's a matter of significant regret, because the parking is one of the other dimensions of the general problems that are being faced in terms of a lot of the town centre sites. It's all part of the nexus of the impossibility of the delivery of these sites. So it's an area where any relaxation or the potential creation of any loopholes, and I'm appreciating that nobody's attempting to create loopholes, is something that we need to absolutely avoid as much as possible. Is it appropriate if I just make a comment in terms of BE16? And
yes, please. Yes.
This may be hopelessly out of date at this point, but if you go back to the version of BE16 as it was originally presented when the council actually voted on this back in 2018, one of the queries that I had in terms of what BE16 says about, or said then, in terms of developments being permitted only when they don't have an unacceptable transport impact and they didn't create significant impacts on the transport network in terms of capacity and congestion, was who was effectively going to be judging that? Because to my mind, it comes back to the question of cumulative effect. I mean, I would expect Essex Highways to be judging it because they are the Highways Authority. But if you're in a situation where this is being judged on a case-by-case basis, an allocation by allocation, site policy by site policy basis, you're effectively moving from a position where if you get in early, there may not be issues because the cumulative effect hasn't yet taken hold. If you come along later, there will be cumulative issues because other developments have already taken place. So, like I say, if the wording has radically changed since then, which I unfortunately haven't had the chance to go back and double check because of the issues I was talking about, then this is irrelevant. But if the wording is still containing a version of what that was saying, I have a query really as to how that is supposed to work and whether it's appropriate to look at these things on a site-by-site basis when in terms of a multiplicity of sites in a relatively small area, some of which may be relatively small sites, but they will have a significant cumulative effect. My question, as I say, it goes right back to the November 2018. My question was whether that policy is really dealing with the issue of the cumulative effect in terms of assessing specific sites. So, I mean, I'd like some kind of an explanation as to whether the wording has significantly changed and that's no longer an issue, or whether it's a meaningless point which I can only see because I'm a layperson and I don't understand the technicalities of this, which is always possible. So it's a query, and I'd quite like some sort of response on that.
I'll leave the council to respond on that, but just to be aware that we're only looking at the plan that's before us. We are not looking at previous wording, etc., etc. But you're fully aware of that, Mr. Minot. So, but I will let the council respond on the points that you've raised. Anything the council wants to add or comment on?
I'm not sure there's anything we can usefully add actually to the discussion. I'm looking at my team and I'm getting 0 responses. Oh, okay, all right then. Ms. Hang is going to say something.
Ms. Hang then, please.
I think in terms of the BE16, the amendments in the amendments in F9A, it's just tightens the wording. So it's the requirements that development has to mitigate its impact to an acceptable level is still there. And in terms of cumulative impacts that Councillor Mr. Minot was concerned with is set out and dealt with by policy BE11 already, so, as we discussed. So I think I hope that clarifies what he's concerned with.
I'll bring in my colleague, Mr. Minot. Anything further? Your hand's still up. Is there anything?
Yeah, I just, as I say, apologies. I've previously been consulting F9A. I haven't been able to go back and reconsult F9A in the run-up to preparing for today's meeting. So I haven't been able to read the latest versions of these things. And it is obviously quite difficult sometimes to follow the paper chase of revisions and counter revisions and rescindings of previous revisions. So apologies on that. But I mean, I don't know whether I've got an issue. This is the problem because I haven't been able to double check. I wanted to raise it because I had a concern.
Mr. Minot, what might be helpful is obviously, and I was going to raise this at the end anyway, that all participants who have been invited to this session will be invited to the future further transport session. where we'll be looking at more in relation to highway related matters. So if there is something that you wanted to come back to, I will allow, because it sounds like you've had some technical issues looking at the correct documents, etc., etc. I'm more than happy for you to provide any details at that point. We have no idea when that will be as yet. That won't be decided for a while, but we're more than happy to hear from you again, even if it does mean going back to some of the policies. We can have a look at that wording again. Okay.
Yeah,
would that help, Mr. Minot?
That's very helpful. I'll take the opportunity to have a look and work out whether I've got a genuine issue.
You'll be invited to come along to the next transport session anyway. So that will just and that's for all those that have been invited this morning. You will all be just automatically get an invite to that session. So, Mr. Warden. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Warden.
Thank you, Mrs. White. My question relates to BE 17. So, is it appropriate to ask that question now?
Yep.
I know the council are going to look at the wording of this policy in relation to parking standards, but my question was about part B, and I'm looking at the F9A amendments, and it's about the word relaxed, which is proposed in there, which are proposing change from flexible. My understanding of the parking standards, and perhaps Councillor Mr. Robinson will be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a mixture of minimum and maximum parking standards, so that I'm not sure that in relation to maximum parking standards, the word relaxed would then be appropriate if it is, for example, the intention that there may be, because then the part B is seeking to minimise pressure on land and encourage alternative use of transport. And if there are minimum standards, then that would be right. But if the standards are maximum, for example, the number of spaces at an office, which is in part A, then I'm not sure that's the right wording. I think what you're trying to say is that you might require less than the standard for certain situations in order to minimise the impact on land and to encourage alternative means of transport.
Yes, on that basis, one would express it as being minimum standards may be relaxed. Absolutely. Whether relaxed, you mentioned the word relaxed, whether that's an appropriate expression or not, we can think about. But that is the point of this, that minimum standards would be relaxed. So just to recap, A will be reworded so that the document becomes a document to which the council will have regard when assessing applications, and B will confirm that the minimum standards in that document may be relaxed in order to achieve those matters set out in subparagraphs A through to C.
And then section C, because you've got proposals which do not conform to the parking standards, so that's obviously would not be.
No, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
So, commensurate changes to that as well.
Okay. Anything further, Mr. Warden?
No, I was interested if Mr. Robinson was going to come in that point about maximum, whether the word needs to be a little bit in terms of what the council is trying to achieve in, for example, office developments. I think what the council is trying to say is that there will be less parking spaces than would normally be expected, because we're trying to have less land taken up by car parking, and we're trying to get people there by public transport, for example, or by cycling. And as I understand it, office parking requirements are maximum in the standards, not minimum. Is that correct, Mr. Robinson?
I couldn't say for certain, but I believe that would be, that's probably correct, as far as I can say, I'm afraid, without consulting them directly. What I was going to say was that those standards already have some flexibility in them according to type of land use and location of site being referred to. So we question why you would need another set of standards.
That was exactly going to be my point. Do you actually need B at all if you're just going to be having regard to the parking standards in the policy? As long as it's made clear.
I expect the best thing to do would be for us to go away, have a look at the standards and to see how they're applied, and then revisit this policy once we've done that. And then if we think that the policy needs rewording, as already discussed, or with other changes to reflect the document itself, we will provide you with a note to explain why we've done what we've done.
Thank you. That'd be very useful.
Okay.
Thank you.
Is there anything further, Mr. Warden?
No, thank you, Mrs. Wright.
No. Okay. Thank you. I know we've gone slightly over, but thank you very much for your contributions to the sessions this morning. And we will be back at 2 o'clock for participants who are coming along who have been invited to the Dunton Hill session Matter 6. So thank you very much for your contributions.
Thank you,
and those who are coming along to Matter 6, we will see you then. So thank you very much.
Thank you.